there and sipping their wine. They all knew what they were waiting for, once the agonized screams had started to ebb and fade. Sure enough, after a while the maester appeared at the door. "Lady Asher." "My lords. Lord Greyjoy wishes to see you. He has not long left." It was good that Stannis Baratheon had warned them all what it would be like to visit the room of a dying man with a stomach wound, because otherwise he would have gagged a little at the smell that no amount of scented candles could get rid of. The Lord of the Iron Islands was a huddled shape on a blood-stained bed, even with the bandages. If he had been thin-faced before his mortal wound, he looked worse now, his face all angles and hollows, his eyes sunken and dull. As they entered the room, Asher went over to him at once, whilst Theon stood in the middle of the room, Mist next to him, a pale erect figure with a look that combined sorrow with a wish to be elsewhere. Jon made way for the Reader and the Lord Hand, both of whom looked at Balon Greyjoy with hard eyes. The dying man looked at his daughter and sighed a little, before looking around the room. "Ah," he said in the merest of tired voices. There was blood on his teeth, as if he had screamed his throat raw. "Witnesses." "Good." Father Asher started to say, before being silenced by a wave of his hand in the air. "I have no time left. You are my heir. Just you. They," and here he directed a savage glare at the others in the room, "they are here to witness this. Nothing else. Nothing for them." A complicated expression crossed his face, as many emotions seemed to clash. "You were right. Right about many things. He closed his eyes for a long moment, whether in anguish of emotion or in pain, Jon could not tell. "I was wrong. I heard it. Heard the call. Damn fair persuaded me, otherwise." "Yes," Father Asher said with a sigh. "I suspected that. If anyone stands against you, if any fools question you, you are my heir. If Drum questions you, kill him." "Yes, Father." There was a long moment of silence. "Kill Euron. He's not right. Never was, but now, he's something else. Something terrible. I will, Father, I swear it." The man was visibly weakening, his head wobbling. "Burn me. After I die." And then he was gone, the light fading from his eyes. Jon bowed his head for a moment and then looked up at Stannis Baratheon, silently touched his shoulder and then gestured at the door. As they filed out, leaving the weeping figure of Asher Greyjoy behind, he wondered what would happen next. And where Euron Greyjoy was, the mad fucker. Bronn. He'd never really thought about who he'd ever marry. Father had told him once to pick someone who wouldn't snore and who you wouldn't go to bed angry with, which was not particularly helpful. He'd once entertained vague hopes of marrying a barmaid in Old Town, but she'd become attached to some rich twat with deeper pockets than his at the time. And now here he was, standing in the godswood of the Red Keep, by some alchemy that he didn't fully understand. Father had been a believer in the old gods, as he'd lived for a time in Runestone and then again in the Neck, so something had rubbed off on him, but he'd been surprised when Ursula had told him that she wanted the godswood for their marriage. Given the nature of the shield of the Riverlands that never left her side, it seemed fitting. The Foxhold had a small godswood and also a small September, but not that he came to think about it. He couldn't remember the name of the bloody septon that must have been there. Oh. Wait. Yes, he remembered now. The man had left just after he'd taken up the title of Lord of the Foxhold, because he'd heard the call. They'd have another ceremony there once they returned, just to reassure followers of the Seven there. He was wool-gathering again, and after a long moment he looked back at the 6-foot-tall weirwood tree that stood in front of him now. There was the merest suggestion of a slight and very small face on the trunk, and that disturbed him more than anything he could imagine. And then the man next to him, the man with the green cloak and the antlered hood whose name escaped him, cleared his throat and he looked over his shoulder. Ursula Corliss was standing at the end of the line of trees, Lord Arryn next to her. She was wearing a cloak of green and gold over a red dress, and something that he couldn't explain within him knew that those colors were right. Something seemed to have frozen his lungs for a moment, and as he started to breathe again he realized that something must have crossed his face, because Ursula was looking at him with the kind of burning gaze that meant that once they were in their rooms a lot of clothes would be torn off. As she approached he took a deep breath. He had always known that he had the capacity within him to be a right bastard. He'd been a sellsword, and as such he'd done a lot of things that he had not been proud of. That said, he'd always told himself that there were limits, that there were certain things that he would never do, and truth be told he'd kept to those limits. But now he was going to be a husband, and he had to wall off that part of him that could be a right bastard forever. He was lord of the foxhole now, in love with a woman who was descended from royalty and gods. He was in love with her. How could he not be? And now here he was, in this place, at this time. He knew that their marriage was not a thing that he could dare ever fuck up. No. Never. He had to stay true to this, matter what happened. And judging by that gaze from her, he knew that it was the right thing to do. The green man, who had been taking care of the godswood, cleared his throat to one side before launching into the words. He barely heard them, he was too busy looking into her eyes. God's damn night, he was marrying a woman descended from bloody royalty, albeit a long time removed. His father wouldn't have believed any of this. His son, the lord, marrying the daughter, all right, the legitimized bastard daughter of a lord. He knew that there was going to be a lot of fuss over that damn shield, but right now he didn't care. He was going to get married and be happy and make her bloody happy, even if he had to use that particularly athletic position that made his back hurt after a while, but women seemed to adore. Gendry. Apparently he no longer rode like a sack of wet straw jammed onto a saddle, or so his half-sister Maya had said. Well. That was good to know. However, he did not have what she described as poise. He had no idea what that bloody was, other than some way of sitting on a saddle and not falling off. His life had changed in so many ways these past months that there were times that his head hurt. He was a blacksmith's apprentice and he was riding with lords and the king who was his father. His head hurt. He was riding with Maya and the Vale Lords a lot, mostly because he had no intention of going anywhere near that scary bugger Lord Lannister, who could terrify at a glance. And the more he rode north, the more he wondered how many others were also doing the same, driven by the call. On the road he heard so many accents from places he had only ever heard of. The Reach. The Vale. Dawn. All headed to the wall. The end of the world, or so he'd heard in King's Landing. And now the place where there was going to be a war. He couldn't wrap his head around that. He and so many others were heading willingly towards the place where there was going to be a war. They'd spent the night in an encampment where the privies had been rigorously policed after the king had issued orders placing those privies himself. He hadn't understood why until he'd overheard two veteran Baratheon guardsmen talking about how lax privy placement meant men dying of the shits. Now that was a horrible thought. They were in the gift now, and as they rode north they'd met Morthen. They fascinated him, with their bronze armor. They seemed to be in awe of his father for reasons he didn't understand, and totally loyal to Lord Stark, again for reasons that he didn't understand. The Than also fascinated the Royce part of the party, especially Lord Royce with his bandaged armor, with the cloth hiding those bloody runes that kept frustrating him. He could engrave runes easily, but they wouldn't bloody glow. Why? Sarala's words, that he had to think like a first man, kept nagging at him. How? How could he do that? They'd lived all that time ago, without iron, without steel, without so many things that he took for granted. All the things he'd tried to engrave runes that glowed had failed. Every one. It drove him almost mad. He'd hoped that the Than might have had the answer to it, given their bronze armor, but they didn't have any glowing runes on anything they had, which was confusing as they wrote with runes. None of it made any sense, and he brooded over it as they kept riding north. The party paused as they reached the crest of a hill, and he wondered why until the muttered comments rolled their way back through the column. Apparently the king had seen his first glimpse of the wall. He frowned at that. They were at least a day away from the wall, surely. But then as the column resumed he rode up and over the brow of the hill, and like the others he saw that line of white on the horizon and shivered. The wall. Gods, it was huge. As he heard from one Lannister rider, men wouldn't have built such a thing, still less maintain it, unless there had been something terrible beyond it. Something beyond terrible. As evening drew in they made camp again near a village that seemed to have grown a lot recently, given all the new construction and the stones being moved. The king was about the camp once again with Stormbreaker, and he could see how people reacted to the sight of them. Relief. Could he ever do the same? Could he ever make men under his command be relieved by his very presence? No, he couldn't imagine it. Not him. He was just a blacksmith's apprentice. And now, as he sat at a rough table and ate a quite tasty stew, he kept finding his mind wandering. Maya was next to him, japing with some valiman about the lack of spices in the food, but his mind kept going back to those bloody runes. He was missing something. But what? Someone down the table laughed at a comment that someone else had made about the Thun and their bronze everything, before looking guiltily over their shoulder in case one of those scary buggers was near, and then, something clattered into place in his head. What? Maya said after a long moment of looking at him. What's amiss? Do I have bloody spinach in my teeth again? Bronze, he said thickly after a while. The first men used bronze. We use iron. I've been trying to inscribe runes with iron, not bronze. Maya looked confused for a long moment and then seemed to realize what he was talking about. But the Thun use bronze and runes, but their runes don't glow. But they don't inscribe the runes onto their armor. Wait, it must be more than that. Lord Royce's blacksmith tried with bronze and he got odd results with that, some glowed and some didn't. He screwed up his face at that and then concentrated as hard as he could. The first men used bronze. Was that it, or was there something else? He looked about, his mind racing. And then he gulped down the last of his stew, chewed his bread, swigged his ale and stood. Is there any weirwood nearby? This obviously bewildered Maya. What? Weirwood? Did Lord Royce's people use it in their carvings? Why would they have used weirwood in carvings? Because the first men might have had weirwood handles for their tools. And with that he darted outside and looked about wildly. There. He could see red leaves and white branches in a copse to one side. He made himself walk to the trees, thinking everything through. He wasn't clever, not like Shireen, but it all seemed to make sense to him, and as he reached the white-barked trees he looked around for something suitable. After a careful search he finally found a fallen branch that looked about the right size, with a good weight and thickness. He didn't think about using a branch cut from the tree, that didn't feel right. It would mean using green wood, or as green as weirwood got. As he returned to the encampment he could see Maya standing by the tent, looking at him puzzled. Why did you go running out? He held up the branch in response. Right. Are there any Thun smiths in the camp? I need a bronze hammer and a bronze rod, or something like a chisel. Maya stared at him and shrugged helplessly, but then they both started a little when a voice to one side said, I'll talk to the Thun. We'll get you what you need, lad. It was Lord Royce and he looked intrigued as he stood there in his jerkin. I overheard what you said to Maya. Do you really think that might be the answer to the runes? Now it was his turn to shrug. I don't know, my lord. But I have to try this. It's the only thing that makes sense to me. We've all tried so many ways to carve the runes to make them glow, but this seems like, my lord, I can't think of anything else. The Lord of Runestone nodded, laughed softly and then clapped him on the shoulder. Gods, you've your father's face and his stubbornness. Get to the forge and I'll get what you need. He nodded back and then strode off to the forge, which was cooling down after the day's work. That wasn't what he needed there though. What he needed instead was his knives hanging in a bag, and the small lathe. He cut the branch down to the most usable and straight part and then used the lathe to get the imperfections off the surface without taking too much off. After a while Lord Royce arrived with a rather baffled Thun, who handed over what he needed, a bronze hammer and a straight length of bronze. This was perfect and he quickly removed what looked like the pine handle from the hammer and then peered at the hole, before returning to the lathe and shaving what he needed to fit the weirwood handle into the head of the hammer. As for the bronze rod, he used his iron hammer to square one end of it carefully, turning it into a press. And then he pulled out one of the sheets of bronze that he'd been using for his experiments, one of the unused ones obviously. And then, he paused and looked at Lord Royce. I need a rune to carve, or a phrase in runes. Something that means something. Something important. Lord Royce paused and then reached out to grab a piece of cloth and then a quill and a pot of ink. Try this. He wrote quickly and cleanly a few runes on the cloth. It means protection. That should suffice. He looked at the runes, memorizing them, and then he took a deep breath and started to hammer an impression of the runes into the bronze with the hammer and the press, striking as carefully and exactly as he could. After he finished the first rune he paused. Nothing. Keep going, Lord Royce said softly. It's just one letter in a word, so why would it glow? He kept at it, tapping carefully until the runes were finished on the bronze. But then, as they all stared at them, they glowed fitfully for a moment. Deflated, he sat back. I don't understand. That should have worked. Maya looked at the runes and then back at him. You said that we needed to think like the first men. The first men prayed to the old gods. Did you when carving out those runes? He shook his head. No. Maya swapped a glance with Lord Royce, who then cleared his throat. Then try it again, whilst praying to the old gods as you carve the runes. He took this in and then frowned. My lord, I don't know how to. I've never prayed to the old gods before. Call to them, lad. Ask them to help you with every tap of that hammer. So he tried again, this time muttering a prayer to the old gods with every single tap of the hammer into a new sheet of bronze whilst feeling more than a bit awkward. And this time the runes glowed brightly long after he had finished the last one. There was a long silence as the three of them, Maya had been a silent observer of all of this, stared down at the glowing runes. Well, bugger me, Gendry found himself eventually muttering. There's a thing. More than a thing, lad. Lord Royce was beaming at him. Well done. Gendry Baratheon, Stongarm and Runesmith. First Runesmith in thousands of years, said Maya with more than a hint of wonder in her voice. My brother. He flushed at this praise. I just tried to think like a smith of the first men. His Grace the King must know of this. I'll send word to Runestone as well, along with your name. Gendry rummaged in his bag for a moment before pulling out the braces that he'd been working on for some time. They were good steel with a soft leather interior lining. My lord, I was making these for my father. He needs new ones. I was going to engrave stags onto them, but now, he took a deep breath. Lord Royce, which runes would be suitable for his Grace the King? From the look on Lord Royce's face, it was the right thing to say and to do. The older man nodded and bent over another scrap of paper to sketch out more runes whilst Maya looked at the leather. That'll need ringlets and leather lacing. Let me help. He nodded. Leatherwork wasn't his strongest skill, he wasn't bad at it, but he knew that Maya was better as she could work on saddles with ease. It wasn't hard work, but it was fiddly to find the right-sized bronze sheets, both identical, and then precisely stamp the runes into them. Once he'd done that, he detached the leather, which he handed to Maya, who squinted at it and then muttered about his crap stitching, so that she could work on it, before attaching the sheets to the curved steel braces with carefully placed bronze pins. This was bloody fiddly, but he needed the practice for the more ornamental work. All of this took time, and he realized after a moment that he had an audience. Toothen were watching him, looking extremely impressed, whilst that other Vale Lord, Lord Redfort, was watching as well. Maya handed the leather back to him and he raised his eyebrows. She had done very good work indeed. He smiled at her, reinsert the leather into each bracer, and then addressed the last remaining little things that needed to be smoothed out. Only then did he stand and show what they had made to Lord Royce. The Vale Lord nodded, approving them, and then held out some sacking. Wrap them up and then follow me, the pair of you. The moon was rising as they left the forge, and the camp was starting to quieten as men and women started to retire to their beds. However, there was still light and activity at the king's tent, where Sir Barristan Selmy was standing guard outside. He straightened as he saw them approach. Lord Royce. Sir Barristan. We need to see his grace, we have important news. The old Kingsguard dipped his head and then slipped into the tent. There was a rumble of voices, and then he came out again and held the flap of the tent open. His Grace will see you. His father the king was sitting on a camp stool, looking at messages, whilst Lord Tarly and Gendry gulped nervously. Lord Lannister sat in chairs by a small table looking at papers. As they entered, 3 sets of eyes looked at him and he felt his cheeks flame with tension. What's this information, Lord Royce? The king boomed. Lord Royce stepped forwards and then handed over the first panel with glowing runes on it. Runes can be carved again, Your Grace. Runes that glow and offer protection against the others. His father sat there, his mouth open in shock, and then he surged to his feet. How? Lord Royce nodded at Gendry and Maya. Your children, Gendry in particular, thought it out. They thought like first men. Where wood handles for bronze hammers to shape the runes and prayers to the old gods whilst carving them. The two lords at the table had also come to their feet, and the king handed over to them the piece of bronze. "It was Gendry more than me, your grace," said Maya quietly. "And he has a gift." With trembling hands he handed over the piece of sacking. "Maya helped with this, your grace." Their father opened the sacking and then went still. "I said the other day I needed new braces," he said thickly after a moment. "You heard then?" "I did." The king pulled the braces out, with their glowing runes. Lord Tarly stared at them whilst Lord Lannister looked at them and then stared at him intently before twitching an eyebrow upwards. "Magnificent," the king said at last before tugging them onto his arms and doing up the lacing. And then as the second one was made fast they all heard the boom of lightning far above as the runes glowed even more brightly for a moment. And just for a heartbeat he swore he could see green fire in the eyes of his father. Jon Stark. He had the overwhelming feeling that many of the Ironborn were absolute pain in the asses, he thought as he watched some idiot lord be dragged away to the dungeons. The man had burst into Pike's Great Hall to claim that his thralls were going to stay on the island, even if he had killed them to make them stay, and that Asha Greyjoy could not rule because she had tits, or some such nonsense. The pale-faced new lady of the Ironborn, with the granite-faced hand of the king and the reader next to her, had reduced him to abject silence with mere words to the guards and a glare. Good. He wanted to be away from this place and back to Winterfell as soon as possible. Because this place gave him the creeping bloody horrors. There were too many idiots here and he didn't envy Asha her task of ruling the Ironborn. At least there had been no further attacks by the others, or at least none had yet been reported. He wondered what it had taken them to mount that blow, to get that iceberg filled with whites and controlled by those three others to the shores of Pike. Valyrian steel blades were not common on the Iron Islands. Nightfall now hung at the hip of the reader, and apparently Housdrum had a sword named Red Rain, which might possibly have belonged to the now dead Rains, based on the name. So, as he too had a Valyrian steel blade, he had to stay around for a bit longer, and he knew that some were wondering how Ned Stark's bastard had such a weapon. The Hand was certainly wondering. Father had told him that the king knew his true parentage, but not the Hand, and he wondered uneasily about how that conversation might go. Asha stood suddenly and then looked at Jon and Theon as she rested a hand on some papers to one side. "My father had a lot of plans," she said after a long moment. "Unrealistic plans in places. He wanted revenge against the North for its part in squashing his rebellion." Ah. He didn't look at Theon. He knew what that other version of him had done in that other time. "These are my late father's plans for the invasion of the North." She picked them up and then walked over to the fireplace and dumped them onto the fire, where they went up with a crackle and a roar. "And that is where they belong. The others come. The Stark has called for aid. We are needed. And that is the end of it." There was a rumble of agreement, and then they all watched as the papers burned. As they did, a door opened to one side and a man walked in quickly. "My lady." "I." Asha said huskily as she looked at him. Then she saw the look on his face and straightened. "What's amiss?" "The Silence has been sighted. In a cove, on the north of the island. About 3 miles away, near Oyster Point." And with those words everyone in the room stood up. It was the first word they'd heard for days of Euron bloody Greyjoy's ship. "Double the guards in the castle, that kinslaying fucker knows his way around here all too well," Asha barked. "Nuncle, ready the Sea Song and any other vessel you need. I want the Silence pinned against the shore. I'll go overland with everyone and—" But then another door banged open and the Maester hurried in, holding a message. "My lady. A message from Winterfell." "Gods, what now?" "It'll have to wait, Maester, the Silence has been seen." "My lady, this might be related. The Mountain is dead. He tried to kill Lord Robb Stark and he was said to be possessed." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then Theon and Jon both roared "What?" at almost the same moment, and then ran towards the Maester, who looked rather alarmed at the sight of their approaching forms along with their direwolves, but who held the message out. Jon got it an instant before Theon, who scowled but then read it over his shoulder. The message was one of madness, but they both relaxed when they read that Robb was fine. "The Mountain is indeed dead," Jon breathed. "Robb and the Hound killed him together. And his eyes, the Mountain's eyes, were black." And apparently just before his head was taken his eyes changed color again and he said that he was attacking the wrong Stark. What does that mean? This is Maester Lewin's hand, Theon muttered as he handed the message over to his sister. He writes that the mountain could have been possessed by a Valyrian spell. Asher looked shocked at this and then read it before showing it to the reader, who was pale. Euron mentioned visiting Valyria. And picking things up there. Gods, did Euron do this thing? What else can he do? Black Eyes Stannis Baratheon said wonderingly after taking the message from the reader. And which Stark was he trying to kill? Jon's scalp prickled as he almost felt the eyes being turned towards him. Why would Euron Greyjoy try to kill me? Surely gods, he surely meant for father to die. He's headed to the High Tower and the gate, where the drowned god is. Send a message to Old Town at once, Stannis Baratheon barked to the Maester. Winterfell must have done so already, but we must be sure on this. Warn Lord Stark at once. He looked at Jon. And you, Jon Stark, must be careful. At least Tyrion Lannister had those warnings of his. We have nothing like that. The Maester looked from the hand of the king to Asher Greyjoy, who nodded, before bowing and striding briskly out. Right, said Asher quietly, before running a hand through her hair and closing her eyes shut as she obviously thought things through. Uncle, take 3 ships, with ballista on them. As I said, we double the guards here in Pike and warn them to watch out for that kinslaying fucker Euron. He knows every way in and out of this castle, so have everyone be on their guard. Warn the whole island. No one is to help him. In the meantime we will head over to the cove where the silence is and see what's happening there and if he and his crew have landed there. Ygritte, Theon, have you replaced your arrows? We have, said Ygritte, who had moved close to Jon and was glaring at every dark corner as if there was a threat there. Even found some dragon glass on the beach. There must be a place nearby where it can be mined. Gods, Jon muttered, I pray for no more others and whites. The reader, who still had nightfall at his hip, nodded curtly at that. Uncle, we'll take banners with us, said Asher. When we are in place on the landward side we'll signal you. Stand off the headland, out of sight, until you see our signal. Then sail in, anchor fast and train your ballista on the silence. The tide and the wind should be right for that, unless the wind shifts in the next hour or so. Is that clear, everyone? My Lord Hand, will you join me? I will, replied Stannis Baratheon, before directing a shrewd look at her. You're showing how you'll lead, aren't you? How can I not? Asher shook her head. If I cannot stand against my mad uncle, a kinslayer and who was willing to give us up to the others, then how can I command the Ironborn? There was a silence and then she nodded again. Right, let's be about it. He had to say this about Asher Greyjoy, she knew how to get things organized. The reader bowed formally at his niece and then strode out whilst the rest of them gathered their things and then also headed out of the doors. As they went through the castle Jon could hear orders being roared and the sound of men and women scurrying about. By the time they made it to the main gate of Pike there was a group of guards standing there, a mix of men in different colors from different houses, but all with hard eyes guarding for any threat. Ygritte was still sticking close to him and he eyed her. Euron's going after my father, not me. She looked at him as if he was an idiot. Know that for a fact, do you? Well, no, but... Shut up, you idiot. You know nothing, Jon Stark. Which was the answer he was expecting, so he sighed, looked down at Ghost, who looked back at him, and then waited until Asher Greyjoy gave the order to march. 3 miles was not far, but that last half a mile was more stealthy as the scouts spread out and then reported back with a local minor lord who bowed hastily at Asher and greeted her, my lady. Lord Tarling. You reported seeing the silence. Aye, me lady, but, his face worked suddenly. There's summat not right with her. She looks wrong, neglected somehow, as if she'd been abandoned for months. But I swear that she wasn't there last night, me lady. I swear it. She wasn't there. Asher stared at the man and then nodded, before issuing more orders. A chain of runners was organized, the last of which held a banner, so that the readers' ships could be summoned properly. And then they marched onwards, before starting to crawl as they reached a rise overlooking a bay. A ship was anchored there and even to Jon's eyes it didn't look entirely right. The sails looked as if they had been furled in a hurry at the very least and the vessel had a slight list. Asher stared at it with wide eyes, before she and the Lord Hand both took out Mirish eyeglasses and stared at the ship. "That's not right," Asher said slowly as she inspected the silence. "None of that's right. She looks fucking terrible. The sails have been furled by, no Ironborn would furl a sail like that. And those sails are faded and worn. The rigging looks ragged, no one's holystoned that deck in a month at least and she's listing. Look at the outlet for the chain pump," muttered Stannis Baratheon. "No water on the planks under it. No one's pumped her bilges in a while. If I knew nothing better, she's been abandoned for weeks. This makes no sense. No sailor would treat that ship so poorly. No one on deck either. Lord Tarling, you are sure that the Silence was not there last night?" Asher asked of the local lord. "And is there any sign of her crew?" "The cove has no sign of any landing," my Lady Tarling replied. "Nor any sign of any other landings in the other coves nearby. No boats, no sign of footprints beyond the high water line, or even under it when it could be seen at low water." Ash bit her lip at that, before taking a deep breath. "All right. Send the signal." It took a little time for the runners to go and pass the message on, but eventually the three sleek shapes of the Reader's command appeared beyond the vaguely oyster-shaped headland in a line before shivering their sails, furling them and then anchoring with a precision that seemed to impress Stannis Baratheon enough to grunt approvingly. Jon could see the Reader himself at the back of one of the ballista that were now trained on the Silence, which just sat there, swinging at its anchor, with no one on deck. No alarm being sounded. Nothing. Just looking at the damn ship made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, and it was then that he looked at the direwolves. Both of them had their hackles up as they looked fixedly at the ship. They were both broadcasting the same word, danger. He looked at them and then at Theon, who looked worriedly back at him. "What do they know that we don't?" Theon asked softly. He looked at Jon and then asked even more softly, "Can you walk into Ghost?" "Ah." He sighed gustily, sat down and then placed a hand on Ghost's head and tried to remember all of Arya's not particularly coherent explanations. He vaguely sensed Asher saying something and Theon snarling something back before he finally made that connection. All of a sudden he had too many legs, but that was fine, he knew how to walk, sort of. He peered back. Oh. That was him, with the white eyes and the pale expression, whilst Ygritte looked at him, his body that is oddly, and Asher Greyjoy stared at him as if she couldn't believe what was happening. And then he looked at the ship. He could feel his eyes widening and then all of a sudden he was back in his own body, shaking with terror. "Gods," he spat eventually. "There's something badly wrong with that." "What did you see?" Theon asked. He struggled for a long moment to express what his direwolf had sensed. Sensed, not saw. Blood. Evil. Something terrible has happened there. The men and women around him muttered uneasily at that and at him, although he heard Ygritte snarl that she'd seen more warging north of the wall and they were not to be such fools. Asher looked uneasy at that and then spoke in a low voice with Stannis Baratheon. And then she snapped out orders for a longboat to be brought down to the beach, for there to be a boarding ladder on it, lanterns, flints, short bows, arrows and short swords. He frowned at this and Asher pointed at Dark Sister. "Ever fought on board a ship? Not much room there to swing a sword, even one like that. A dark place, a ship. Full of awkward angles. If Euron and his crew are on that ship, maybe they are and maybe they are not, then we might need to fight. If they are on it, then where are they though? And why does that ship look like shit?" Theon sounded annoyed as he took his longsword off his belt and took a short sword and a short bow, before shouldering a quiver with a selection of arrows. "We'll have to go and see," Jon sighed as he removed Dark Sister and handed it over to the Baratheon guard. "Mind that well, please." He then took up a short sword as well, made sure he had a dragonglass dagger at his hip and looked at Ygritte, who was looking at the longboat which was now in the cove with little enthusiasm. "Are you coming?" She shot him a look of pure scorn. "Of course I'm coming. If it's a trap, then I'll smell it first. And if there are others or whites on board, I'll smell them first. You lot are children when it comes to fighting them." "I know, because I know nothing." He grinned at her and then pointed at her bow. "That's too long. Take a short bow. You know nothing about fighting on a ship." He grinned still further when she stuck two fingers up at him in the old gesture of defiance. The direwolves would not go on the longboat, and that reinforced that feeling he had that something was very wrong. Instead he and Theon left them at the feet of Stannis Baratheon, who watched them go as the longboat was rowed out by a crew of 10 men, 5 to a side. Asha stood at the bow, with one of her men, Darin by name, whilst he, Theon and Ygritte sat near the man on the rudder at the stern. They rowed a curving path, from the cove almost out to the sea song, where Asha and the reader had a shouted conversation, and then back to the silence. As they approached, Jon eyed it worriedly. The ship looked worn, as if it had sailed for months through rough seas with no maintenance, and as they approached its sides he stared at the portholes, looking for any sign of life. There was none, no movement in those dark and empty holes in the side of the ship. Boat hooks reached out from Asha and Darin as they lurched by the ship, and then after the rowers had stowed their oars the boarding ladder was hooked on and the longboat moored to it. Asha looked about, her face strained. Right. We do this now. I'll go up the right-hand side of the boarding ladder, Darin the left. Those of you with bows keep your eyes peeled. If I see anyone waiting for us, I'll yell. The reader's watching this side and the Lord Hand has the other, and we'll hear if anyone on either side sees anything. Be wary all of you. Ulf and Torren, you stay here and guard the boat. Sing out if you hear anything. The rest of you'll follow me with the lanterns. He watched as the 2 Ironborn swarmed carefully up the ladder, paused at the top, peered quickly over the side and then again further over, and then vanished over the top. For a long moment his heart was in his mouth, fearing the worst, but then Asha's head reappeared. Up! She called. All clear. This was a good thing, as Ygritte was looking rather green in the lurching boat, but she seemed to recover as they climbed the ladder and then assembled on the deck of the Silence and looked about. His gut was churning for some reason that he didn't understand, and he looked about carefully. Nothing. There was no sign of anyone, as before. No sign of life. After a long moment something caught his eye. What's that? He pointed at a piece of leather that was flat on the deck and which looked out of place. Asha walked over to it and picked it up in a gloved hand, before frowning. Part of the rigging, she said, looking up. Only, this is wrong. It's rotted leather. That's not right. It's a strap for the sail. A reef point. No one sane would sail with this attached to their sail. Euron's not sane, but he's still an Ironborn, Theon said grimly, before pointing at a door at the prow of the ship. We need to check that. 2 of the Ironborn sailors crept forwards, short swords ready, before opening the door and then peering carefully in. Both then gagged slightly and pulled faces before looking in again. Bunks, my lady, one called out to Asha. For the 4 Pirk. 4 of them. Smells from rotted food on plates in them. Badly rotted food. Apples, bread, some cheese, all rotted and green. Asha Greyjoy stalked forwards and peered into the room, before pausing. Stand back, she said quickly. That should all be covered in flies and maggots. There are flies, but they are all dead. Poison? Someone asked as they all looked uneasy. Maybe, Asha said warily, before gesturing at the covering for the hold that was before the mainmast. Light the lanterns and let's see what she was carrying. What she was carrying, as was revealed by the lantern that they lowered into the hold with a rope, was not very much. There seemed to be some boxes, but what they contained was a mystery. There was, again, no sign of life. Right, Asha said as she took a deep breath and then looked at the closed doors at the stern of the ship that Jon now knew led downwards, like the rest of the lanterns, and let's be about this. Be wary, all of you. They opened the doors quickly, with Theon and Ygritte standing ready with their bows, but there was no one behind them, just a patch of sunlight that showed the start of a staircase going down and then a dark void. Heart-pounding, Jon took the lead with Asha on this, descending stair by stair with Asha, who was like him holding a lantern aloft with her left hand and a short sword in her right. The others were behind them, watching and swiveling lanterns as they descended. Nothing. At the base of the stairs was a closed door on their right, at the stern of the ship, and a sliding door to their left. Crew's quarters, Asha whispered as she pointed left, and then as she pointed right, Captain's quarters. Euron. They paused and listened. Again, nothing. Then Jon frowned. Captain's quarters has a door that opens outwards. Why? Asha pulled a face. It can be bolted shut from the inside. Makes it harder to break in during a mutiny. Ah. Left first. Darin grabbed the door handle with his gloved hand, looked at them all as he counted from 5 to 1 and then pulled it open. They stood there, ready for anything, but nothing emerged apart from a smell of rotted food again. John peered in. This was beyond odd. There were hammocks in various states hanging from heavy-duty hooks in places or just laying on the floor. And no sign of life. Sea chests are all there, Asher said musingly. She pointed at one hammock. And someone's flute. Where's the fucking crew though? Eric, Tom, the galley's through there. Have a careful look. The two men hurried forwards and then hurried back, looking nauseous. Rotted food again, my lady, one of them said, looking as if he wanted to throw up. Gods, that's bad. No sign of the crew again. Where the fuck are they all? Asher muttered, before turning and looking back at the closed door. There's hardly room for them all to be in there. Right. Stand ready. John stood by the door and reached out with the same hand that held the short sword for the handle. It turned slowly under his hand and he looked about to make sure that the others were ready. They were equals by their nods, and then he pulled the door open and stepped back to deal with any attack. What he was attacked with was the overwhelming stench of blood. Gods, it was foul and cloying. He looked into the room and almost threw up. Blood. It was everywhere. It coated every surface. It was dripping down the walls, off the tables, down off their chairs, off the ceilings. Gods, it was everywhere. He froze. It was dripping. That meant it was fresh. No clotting. So, very fresh. Gods, he said thickly. Has this just happened? It's fresh. Still dripping, and he paused, suddenly struck with the certainty that there was someone horribly wrong with the world. And then he looked up. The ceiling was plastered with a horrible combination of blood, skin, bone, hair, and must have been muscle. And in the middle of the ceiling was what looked like a large and malformed skull of some kind, in the eye sockets of which were a pair of blood-stained eyes. And as John looked up at it, those eyes looked down at them. Afterwards John could never explain what sparked that automatic instinct for pure survival in him. He wrenched his eyes from the horrible thing in the ceiling and threw his lantern against the desk in the room so hard that it shattered and sent burning oil everywhere. A moment after that he slammed the door shut, pulled out his bolt knife and then thrust it into the door frame so hard that the blade vanished into the wood, leaving the hilt which jammed the door shut. Run! John roared at the others and was swiftly rewarded by them fleeing up the staircase as fast as they could. As they went up he could feel something thump against the door and then make a noise of distress that was enough to make him snatch Asher's lantern from her hands and then throw that at the base of the stairs behind him. The oil went everywhere down there and caught fire in an instant, sending greasy smoke into the air as the drywood started to catch. Up they ran, and John swore as one of the steps cracked and broke as his foot went through it, but he pulled himself up with a hand on the rail, and as they emerged into the daylight he grabbed Theon's lantern and threw that down the stairs as well. Watch out! The call came from Darin, who was looking upwards, and John realized that there were pieces of rigging now hanging loose from the mainmast, which was audibly groaning, and then as he looked at it a great crack appeared in the wood. Something screamed or groaned under their feet and the ship shivered. Off! Jump for your lives! John roared. Never mind the boat, over the side and swim to the reader's ship. Whatever tone he used must have been a convincing one, because the party turned as one and made for the side of the ship. As John reached it the mast groaned again. The Grit was trying to say something as the others all vaulted the side and dove into the water, but he paid her no mind. Jump! Still she tried to say something, so instead he picked her up and jumped as something screamed again in the interior of the ship. They plunged through the water and then he kicked upwards, up towards the light. As they broke the surface he could see that the boat had cast off and was headed away from the ship, and that the others were swimming away from the silence. It was then that Ygritte started to flail desperately in his arms and caught him a right ding on the side of the head that made him get a mouth of seawater. He let go of her and then watched her flail even more desperately. Oh bloody hell, you can't swim properly, can you? She spluttered something and he stroked around to behind her and grabbed her chest just under her breasts. Stop struggling. It's me. I've got you now. Relax. Kick your boots off and then let me get you to the boat. You understand? White-faced and obviously terrified, she nodded slightly and abruptly went limp after wiggling her body more than a bit as she kicked off her boots. He took a deep breath and then started to carefully tow her back towards the now approaching boat. As he did, he could hear Asher Greyjoy shouting her uncle to sink the fucking ship, "It's possessed or something. Lose your ballista now." There was shout of acknowledgement, and then, just as Jon and Ygritte reached the boat and the men in it reached over to pull them up and out, he heard the deep thuds as the bolts were loosed from the trio of ships at that accursed ship. All hit, gouging deep holes in the side of the ship. As he heaved himself up and into the boat and then checked on Ygritte, he looked back at the Silence, where smoke was now billowing up from the back of the ship. And as he watched, the ship seemed to be rotting to pieces. The mainmast failed at its base and topped backwards over the stern, the rotted sail smothering the smoke for an instant, and Jon froze. There was something moving under that sail, something that didn't look right. It was also on fire as the sail went up like kindling. Whatever was under it slumped downwards. Had there really been something there? Had it instead been a trick of the light? What the fuck was that? Theon called out from the prow of the boat, and he knew that he had not just been him and that it hadn't been a trick of the light as the ship burnt. The Silence shuddered visibly again, and then, as the men behind the oars shook off their shock and struck out for the sea song as hard as they could. He could see the Silence and it horrified him. The ship seems to be changing color, as if the wood itself was decaying in front of their eyes. He could hear the reader shouting orders to buoy the anchors and then prepare to cut the hawsers and make all sail, and looked around wildly to see that Asher and her men were swarming up ropes on the sea song. As they reached the reader's ship's hawsers were let down from derricks, the oars were stowed, the hawsers attached to davits, and then he grabbed Ygritte and hung on as the boat was hauled bodily out of the water and hoisted up to deck height and then swung aboard. The men were moving with a frantic speed, and as he helped a retching Ygritte, how much sea water had she swallowed? Off the boat he heard the reader shout out to make sail. He strode to the side of the ship and joined the dripping wet Asher and Theon at staring at what remaining of the Silence, which was now low in the water, on fire and crumbling quickly. And then it seemed to somehow get compressed together in a horrible maelstrom of swirling wind, rotting wood, fire and water spray that howled into the skies for a long moment before it finally vanished beneath the waves with a bubbling roar. The Sea Song and the other ships were moving by now, and it was a good thing that they were, because he really didn't like the look of the fiery bubbles of something that kept rising to the surface, along with very dead fish. Away they sailed, and as he sat down heavily on the deck he could see men at the mainmast signaling to the party at the cove. He was wet, had been badly shaken and needed new boots. By the time that they docked again near Pike and then met the others in the great hall, he was drier and had new boots and was wondering what was wrong with Ygritte. She'd recovered from her near drowning and also had new boots, but was looking at him differently and he wasn't sure why. He also had Dark Sister at his hip again, and he thanked the guard that had returned it. And then he told the tale of everything that had happened on board the Silence, backed up by the others, including a very pale Asher Greyjoy, as they ate a hurried supper. "Lord Jon here saved our lives, I'm sure of that. He moved fast when he saw that thing in there, and throwing the lantern in was a good idea." Asher Greyjoy sighed. "Lord Tarling, if any wreckage of the Silence washes ashore, it is to be burned at once. That ship was accursed. I have no doubt that what we saw in that cabin was the remains of my mad uncle's crew, and I have no idea what horrors he inflicted on them or what purpose he had. All I know is that he is to be killed on sight if he lays foot on the Iron Islands again. But where can he be?" The reader mused as he stroked his chin. "He vanished on that beach, his ship is gone. His crew is dead, I hope, and no ships have been reported stolen. Where is he?" Silence greeted this question, and Jon stroked the fur between Ghost's ears. The direwolf was himself again and no longer fearful. The danger had passed for the time being. "Once I know that Pike is secure, you and I should go to Great Wyk, Nuncle Roderick," Asher said eventually. "You too, my Lord Hand, if you please. We need to talk to the Stonerbrows and find out what they know. This civil war that my father started is over. His body must be burned anyway," the reader said somberly. "As you promised him. It's not the Ironborn way, but that needs to be the point now. The old way is gone. It died with your father and Damfair." There was a pause, and then they went their separate ways. He was tired, he needed clean clothes and to wash the salt off him, and he needed to think about what they had witnessed that day. He knew without a shadow of doubt that father was in danger from that mad bastard Euron Greyjoy, he just didn't know how the mad Ironborn could beat father to Old Town. But as he started to close the door to his room, it was blocked and then pushed open. "Ah. Grit. Are you all right? He asked the words quietly and then frowned as she closed the door behind them and then walked up to him. I am fine, but you need to shut up and let me talk, she said softly. If we were north of the wall, then my father would have cuffed you about the head by now and told you to stop being a stubborn bastard and admit that you love me. Because I know that you do, just as I love you. Grit, he started to say, only for her to cut him off with a gesture. Shut up. Do you deny you love me? He stared at her, his blood boiling. You know that I do. The words sounded strained. But I never know where I stand with you. She looked at him. Right. Stand there. Frowning he did as she walked behind him. You saved my life 3 times today. Once when you slammed that door, once when you swept me off that hell ship, and then finally when you saved me from drowning. North of the wall, that would make me your wife. So I am your wife, don't turn around yet. And we can do whatever silly Neela ceremony you like later. But here and now it's just you and me and this bed. Now turn around. He turned. She was standing there, stark naked, in front of him. And in her eyes was nothing but invitation. So he stepped forwards, into her arms and swept her onto the bed as he kissed her mouth at last properly and helped her take those bloody salt-stained clothes off. Sleep was forgotten for the time being. They were finally together. Bran. Normally the pool in front of the heart tree in the Godswood looked inviting. The water was always warm and still. Today, however, he was looking at it with a real sense of unease as he stood there with Robert, Edric and Ned. The issue was a simple one: did the pool contain Vermix's eggs? And if so, how could they get to them? And who should go into it? It had been Robert's idea, that the natural place for a dragon to lay their eggs had to be in the hot springs in the Godswood, but now that they were all there and looking into the pool, certain nagging doubts were running through his head. Well, judging by the others, all their heads. How deep is it? Ned asked as they peered into it. It goes down to a warm place, Bran said carefully. Now that they were there and looking at it, well, things seemed rather different. And, if he had to admit it, dangerous. I don't know how far down. But the eggs might be there. Edric said again with slightly less confidence than he had before. I mean, it's warm in there. Dragons liked warm places. They all stood there and stared at the pool again. All of a sudden he had a lot of butterflies in his stomach. Perhaps this wasn't a very good idea. But then where else would Vermix have laid those eggs? He was in the process of opening his mouth to say something when someone cleared their throat behind them in a very meaningful manner. They all froze. Oh no. He turned his head. Shireen was standing there, arms crossed, eyebrow raised. And what Shireen said in a voice that made her sound exactly like her father: do you think you are doing? They traded shifty looks, daring the others to break the silence. Finally Robert pointed at the pool. It makes sense that Vermix's eggs are in a place that Vermix couldn't have reached without tearing down the Godswood and enraging everyone, and certainly every Stark in Winterfell. Silence fell as they all thought about that. Then Ned raised a hand. What if Vermix hovered in the air above the Godswood, just above the pool and, you know, aimed and... He was cut off by Shireen raising a hand and then, lips twitching, closing her eyes and shaking her head as she grimaced. Ned. No. Just, no. Now, enough of this nonsense. It's almost time for the midday meal and there's training to be done after that. Deeply deflated, the boys eyed each other again and then sloped off. Bran felt secretly relieved. He was glad that he wouldn't be diving into the pool. Summer was off to one side, rolling on his back on a tree root to get at an itch probably, and he rubbed the direwolf's furry tummy, making him squirm. And then, as the others vanished off through the trees, he saw the direwolf freeze and then stare upwards at about the same time that he heard something snap far above his head. He looked up at the red canopy above him. Nothing until a white twig hit the ground to one side. Something was up there. But what? Bran. It was Edric's voice and he turned. Are you coming? In a bit. I'll meet you in the Great Hall. And then he went back to staring upwards into the branches. There was a faint breeze blowing that rustled the leaves, but he suddenly had the very strong feeling that someone or something was watching him closely. Oddly enough, he felt no threat, just caution. He walked to the heart tree and peered up again. Hello. Is there anyone up there? There was a soft creak and again a twig seemed to snap. Who are you? My friends are gone, it's just me here and my direwolf, Summer. My name is Bran. A pause. More silence. Hello. Something creaked again to one side. Bran looked but saw nothing, and then as he looked back he froze in place. There was a figure hanging by its hands and feet from a branch above. It had brown skin, largish ears, was wearing a green jerkin and was studying him intently through reddish eyes. He never knew how long he stood there, staring upwards at that figure, lost in wonder. And then it seemed to sigh a little, dropped down onto a branch, pivoted with an inhuman grace, bounded onto its feet and then dropped lightly to the mossy earth by the trunk of the heart tree. Bran swallowed. She had 3 fingers that ended in black nails and was studying him closely. After a moment she leant back and sniffed. Hello, Stark. He was lost for words for a moment. Hello. Then he rallied. Are you one of the children of the forest? The reddish eyes almost rolled for a moment. Yes, I am. I didn't know that there were any left in the north. Something flickered in those eyes. We remain here and there. We were away. Protecting ourselves. But now I'm here. He nodded. Then he frowned. How did you know I'm a Stark? She looked at Summer meaningfully. The direwolf was the clue. And then she stared at him, stared as if she was memorizing his face intently. Ah. I was right. Right about what? I can't tell you yet. Confused, he frowned at her. I don't understand. She smiled ever so slightly. I'll explain one day. You should join your friends. They're an interesting group. 2 of them are children of the storm. One is a falcon and the other is part giant. But you can't tell them about me. Not yet. Why not? It's a secret. I can keep a secret. Really? She smiled slightly and leant towards him. So can I. This was deeply strange. He tilted his head. You always been here, have you? This brought him another smile. The green man opened the way here. It's complicated. Let's just say I traveled with him and leave it at that, shall we? All right. He wanted to run and tell the others who he had met, but there was something in those red eyes that stopped him. Why can't I tell the others about you? It's not time yet. When will it be time? Soon. You'll know when. I will. You will. You need to tell your brother about the door though. He stared at her, shocked. The door in the crypts. I thought that Robb knew about it. She closed her eyes for a long moment. He doesn't, not yet. As she opened her eyes again she seemed to pin him in place with a look that he couldn't describe. You have a long way to go. You'll get taller. We are. I do not know the right word. We will be linked, you and I. I'll be here until you need me. And beyond that. Deeply confused he looked at her. I don't understand. You will. There is a fate that you have been turned from and new one that you will embrace. And you can't tell anyone that I'm here just yet, even your friends. But they can keep this secret. Can they? No. She reached out and ran a black fingernail down the side of his face. Ah, I see now. No, they would not understand. The finger reached his lips, paused, and then she touched the same finger to her own lips and smiled slightly. They would not understand. He stared at her, feeling that this was somehow deeply important, that something had happened. You know my name. What's yours? She peered at him again. In your language. I am called Quicksilver. I am young. I have the green sight, so I won't live as long as others. And I have a purpose. And with that she held his face with her hands in a gentle but firm grip, kissed his forehead, each cheek and his lips with a gossamer touch, and then released, stepped back and vaulted upwards into the canopy far above. Chapter 50. Chapter text. It has, once again, been a rather odd and very tiring month. I am so very tired for so many reasons, and fortunately I have a week off of work coming soonish. I would like to make it clear that I am not making a certain character suddenly heterosexual, merely possibly bisexual and deeply confused about the whole thing. Jamie. Teaching someone like Joffrey took a toll on a man. The boy was sulky, reluctant and seemed to be all thumbs and left feet. He also didn't seem to understand the time it would take to learn how to fight properly. Why is this so hard? The boy had a whine that reminded him of his mother at times. I'm a Lannister, this should be easy. He stared at the boy. True learning comes through constant repetition. Constant practice. You think that my skill with a blade came overnight? I was in a training yard in Casterly Rock every morning and afternoon from the age of 6, practicing, practicing, practicing. He held up a hand and flexed it. Your uncle has a phrase for it that caught my ear once and I liked it, muscle memory. Do something often enough and you can do it without thinking, your mind prepares your muscles without you seeming to think about it. Joffrey scowled the moment that Tyrion was mentioned, but actually seemed to think about it for a moment. The Hound used to say I didn't practice enough. You didn't. He said the words harshly. Your mother thought she was protecting you. She coddled you instead. A look of misery crossed the boy's face at the mention of his mother and he suppressed a sigh. Then he gestured at the practice dummy. Keep at it. It takes time and practice. You should have a talent for it. You're my son. Joffrey flashed a look of conflict and misery at him but then started his practice again. He was sloppy and badly coordinated but the basics were there. Sir Jaime said a voice behind him and he turned to see Jen, that oddly bossy wilderling woman who helped out the Maester at times. According to other Bained she'd been married to some demented lunatic who worshipped the others enough to give up their sons and the sons he had with the other daughter wives he had to the creatures. Maester Aemon wishes to see you. He looked at her, noted her intent look and then nodded. Very well. Joffrey, keep practicing those forms. The boy grunted but kept at it as they walked towards the Maester's office, up a set of new stairs and then over to the door, which Jen rapped on quietly, slipped in, talked in a low voice and then came out again. Maester Aemon says to come in. He walked past her to discover that the old Maester was sitting at his desk, many books open in front of him. For a moment he thought of Tyrion with deep fondness, but then thrust that thought behind him. Maester Aemon. Sir Jaime, come in if you please. The Maester sounded tired and Jaime looked at him carefully. The Maester looked up and then smiled slightly. Your pardon. Tiredness and worry. Sit, please. Worrying news from Winterfell came some days past and the Lord Commander and I have been asking questions of many people. He sat as requested and then looked at the old man. What news? The Maester of Castle Black leant back in his chair and looked at him. The Mountain Sir Gregor Clegane is dead. And in most odd circumstances. Jaime just stared at the man for a long moment. The Mountain dead. He said the words in disbelief. Then he leant forwards, dread roiling in his guts. How? What happened at Winterfell? It would seem that he killed the two men acting as his wardens, given his proclivities, and then tried to assault Mance Rayder's good sister, being stopped in that assault by Robb Stark. He then tried to kill Robb Stark. The dread deepened. Oh gods, he muttered. Is the Stark boy dead? Fortunately not. He was able to fight Sir Gregor off for long enough for Sandor Clegane to intervene eventually. Between the two of them, well, three if you include the girl they killed him. But here is the thing, Sir Jaime the Mountain's eyes were jet black in all of this. The Maester raised a gnarled finger that circled his right eye. All of his eyeballs jet black. He just stared at the Maester for a long moment. I don't understand. He was possessed, Maester Aemon said almost sadly. Maester Lewin in Winterfell said that, based on a reading of a book there that I should very much like to read, he was possessed by an old Valyrian spell that allowed someone to walk into him. Something that many describe as, well, as being evil. Jen said the word by the door. Evil. Walking into a human is evil beyond words. She said the words as if they hurt her mouth saying them. He struggled with this for a long moment. Someone walked into the mountain. Yes, the old Maester said heavily. Sir Gregor had apparently told people that he had been suffering from dark dreams. It might have been a premonition. He was indeed possessed but fortunately was killed. How? Jamie blurted the word in general bafflement. He was a giant of a man, how did they kill him? Maester Eamon tilted his head a little. From what was written, Robb Stark stuck a dagger in his eye. This was insufficient. Sandor Clegane then stuck a sword through his chest. This too was insufficient. Whoever was watching the man then said, through his mouth, that he was trying to kill the wrong Stark, whereupon Robb Stark thrust another dagger into his other eye, after which Sandor Clegane struck his head from his shoulders. Which was sufficient. However, it must be said that your brother said that the warnings glowed red near the body, which was burnt. He sat there for a long moment, trying to think all of that through. The wrong Stark. Indeed. The first ranger has been warned and we are now quietly talking to anyone who has had dark dreams. Which brings me to you, Sir Jamie. I know that I said that you should come to me when you were ready to talk about the dark dream that you had on the way to Castle Black, but this threat of people warging into people is too much to ignore. I have to ask you this: what was your dream? He sat there, struggling for words for a long moment. I was in Casterly Rock, he said eventually. After a battle against the others and their whites that the Westerlands had thoroughly lost because of my father's inability to believe in the threat we were facing. White giants with tree trunks had smashed the gates of the Lion's Mouth. We were losing. I met Tyrion, who said that we should flee, and then I went to my father's solar. There was word that Ned Stark held a fist again, but no one knew what that meant. My family was there, my father, Cersei and, well, our son. My father agreed that the rock was lost, Cersei harangued us, and then, well, then I knew it was just a dream, I think, because there was this odd noise and then there was this other on the back of a giant blue spider that he'd used to climb the rock. I remember dying in this dream, as the hound got just my son out, and this voice in my head as I died, telling me to get up, that I belonged to it, and that was it. He looked at the old maester and was shocked to see that he was gripping the arms of his chair as if he was in pain, whilst Jen's eyes were very wide and her mouth hung open. Maester Eamon, it was just a dream. You did not know that the others have been known to ride such creatures. The oldest remaining Targaryen said the words carefully and he felt the blood drain from his face. Giant blue spiders. Ice spiders, Jen said in tones of dread. Wildlings have seen them riding such creatures. It is not widely known amongst the Night's Watch, but is being talked about as they will have to be dealt with when they attack. Maester Eamon leant back in his chair, steepled his fingers and looked at him with those Targaryen eyes. Well, now. Interesting. Where were you when you had this dream? Describe the location. In a grove of trees, in the gift, Jamie explained, feeling bewildered. I slept with a blanket under my head on a tree root. Eamon tilted his head a little. What kind of tree? A weirwood tree. When I woke and went around it to, relieve myself, I saw a face carved into it. You pissed on a heart tree. Jen spat, obviously angry. He looked at her, baffled and confused, before shrugging, which seemed to anger her even more. Jen, enough. The maester said the words softly, but with enough power to make her glare diminish a little. Most interesting. Why interesting? Because my boy, I think that you have a touch of the green sight. He just stared at the man, genuinely unsure what to say. The green sight. Like my uncle Geryon and his son say they have. Oh, they don't just say that they have it, they truly do have it, Sir Jamie. When they were here in Castle Black I talked to them carefully. A terrible and nebulous gift, the green sight. Divining what it means can be like trying to hold smoke. You think you have it and then it is gone. Better perhaps than prophecy. Roriger thought he understood prophecy. The old man's upper lip curled into a snarl. The fool. Jamie struggled with where this conversation had taken them. But what I dreamt about, what was it then? A future perhaps, one that is mercifully lost to us. You said that Lord Stark held the fist again, the fist of winter. He now holds it. No, what you saw was like something your brother once told me of in a dream of his own. Interesting. I must think on this. He nodded absently, still bewildered, and then he heard the sound of horns in the far distance, brassy and abrupt. Ah, said Maester Eamon as he stood. His Grace the King approaches. Sir Jamie, if you have any dreams that disturb you, please come to me at once. He nodded and stood as well, before following the old maester to the door and then looking up at the wall dully. Robert Baratheon was about to arrive and father would be in his wake. He couldn't deal with father right now. It was time to stand his watch on the wall. Brynden. As they approached Castle Black he could almost feel the wall, like a presence in his head. There was something there, something that he couldn't put his finger on, like the opposite of a shadow. That made no sense, he knew, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He could see blonde hair loom into view out of the corner of his eye and he knew without even looking that it was Brian. "Do you feel it too?" She asked the question with something in her voice that said that she felt the same thing that he did. "The wall. I feel it. Like, something I can't put into words." She nodded and eyed him for a moment. There was something between them as well, something that he really couldn't describe, or put his finger on either. He liked her more than any woman he'd met in many a year, but he had no idea how to approach her at times. He was too old for her. But there was something there. He looked back at the wall and then ahead at the approaching bulk of Castle Black. The king was near the head of column, with the other lords, but the green man was further back. He'd asked why and the old man had smiled sadly and said that today he'd meet an old friend who had until recently thought that he was dead. Castle Black may have had bulk, but there was no way that their full party would be able to be accommodated in it, so some men had been left behind in Molartown, whilst others were in Queen's Crown, which was bustling again. Even then he could see that some temporary structures had been constructed to one side. He had been to Castle Black once before, years ago, escorting some volunteers for the Night's Watch from Gulltown who Jon Arryn had firmly wanted gone from the Vale in the wake of Robert's rebellion. Then he'd noticed how shabby Castle Black looked, how worn. Now, however, the place looked transformed. He could see new tiles on roofs, new walls, new buildings, a flood of carts coming to and from the place, along with horsemen. As they approached the gates he could see that the place was bustling, but that bustle was quietening down as ranks were formed of men of the Night's Watch, headed by old Jeor Mormont with an older man next to him with the chains of a maester. As the king dismounted the assembled men and women in the courtyard knelt and he took the opportunity to look around at the faces. Yes, that brat Joffrey was there, a conflicted look on his face, but where was the Kingslayer? The king gestured and then as the assembled throng stood he stepped up to the old bear and clasped arms with him. "Lord Commander, good to see you again." "Your Grace," Mormont rumbled. "Castle Black is yours. We must talk in my solar." Robert Baratheon said and then, his face, working a bit, he looked at the maester. "Maester Aemon." "Your Grace," the old man said with a creaking bow. "Be welcome to Castle Black." "Maester Aemon, we are kin," the king said haltingly. "You are, I believe, my great-grand-uncle. You remind me of my grandmother, who I loved most fiercely." "Roll," the old man said with a fond smile. "She was so young the last time I saw her, but she often wrote to me about how happy your grandfather made her." The king nodded choppily and seemed for a moment to be deeply moved. And then he smiled. "We will talk later of her. Well, there is much that I must repair with you." Armor creaked to one side as someone approached and then the old man looked at the green man as he walked up to them and then pulled down his antlered hood. "Aemon." Aemon Targaryen was pale as he looked at the other man. "Duncan. I heard from the Lord Commander that you had survived." He visibly searched for words for a moment. "It seems that I have much to talk about with you. And you are the green man now." "I am," the tall man said quietly. "So we must talk of more things than you might think." The king cleared his throat to one side, before taking Stormbreaker from Sir Barristan and then striding out into the courtyard, where all the assembled men and women looked at him. He looked back at them levelly. "The call has been sent," the huge man called out in his deep voice. "The realm has answered. We know what marches on the wall. We know what comes for us all. Castle Black and the Night's Watch, all of you, will have the full support of the realm. This I swear, by the old gods and the new." He drew his sword and thrust it in the air and as he did so the assembled throng raised their arms and drew swords of their own as they cheered him deafeningly. And as they did the runes on the braces he wore shone. Ed Muir. His sister was dead and he did not know if he should wear black or not. Based upon father's aspect he did not think that he should. Father refused to speak of her, even after news came that Jonarin had taken her head in the Red Keep. He had looked at the message without flinching, passed it to Edmure so that he could read it, beckoned with his fingers for it back and then crumpled it and threw it into the nearest fire, where it vanished. Lysa was gone. And he, if no one else did, mourned her. Yes, in her last days she had been quite mad. But she had been there to help bring him up. That counted for something. So he had quietly, in the September, mentioned her in his prayers. It mattered to him at least. And he needed as much help as possible, because Father would not last forever, he knew that. Yes, he'd rallied, but the bad days, where Father could do little but sit in a chair in his solar, a blanket on his lap, still happened, like today. As he approached Father he looked up from the message on his lap. It would seem, he said wryly, that your search of old stones was for naught. The shield of the Riverlands was not there. It was instead in the foxhold, just over the border, in the vale. The Corlishs had it all along. He thought about this. Aye, but the Corlishs are gone, surely. Lord Corlish is dead, he had no son to inherit. Father sighed. Jonarin gave the foxhold to a Lord Castle, the man who caught Baelish. He hissed the name with venom and hatred. Castle's steward at the foxhold was Lord Corlish's bastard daughter, who Castle had legitimized for reasons that I thought were unclear until now. He has married her. At the Red Keep. Where she bore the shield of the Riverlands. So it is denied to us. He raised his eyebrows at that and then sighed a little. Truth be told, he had been worried about the hunt for the shield. It had at times seemed to be a hunt for a myth, and even if it had been found he wasn't sure about if he should wield it. Does it have powers? Apparently it shone when she first picked it up. Father shook his head and then passed a hand over his forehead as if fatigued, before laughing softly. Edmure, this past year has been like nothing I can ever remember. Legends and myths have sprung to life almost beneath our feet. And I am not well. I'm sorry, my boy. A great burden will be on your shoulders soon. Don't say that, Father, there are many years ahead of you yet. He put his hand on Father's shoulder and was encouraged by the strength in Father's hand as he grasped his arm. Thank you, my boy, but we both know that my recent rally is only delaying the inevitable. Now you spoke of marriage and I might have found someone for you, although not the person you might have thought. Oh. Who is she? Roslyn Free. Father Free. Father sat back and satisfaction danced in his eyes. This one's different. You'll like her. Trust me on this, Edmure. He sighed. Let us talk again after I meet her. Renly. There were times when he almost had to bite his cheek to keep from laughing out loud in the throne room, when fools stood before the Iron Throne and did foolish things. In this case the fool in question was Lord Piglot, a minor lord from the border of the Crownlands and the Stormlands who bore an unfortunate resemblance to, well, a pig. Obviously there were times when courtiers mispronounced his name. Lord Piglot today was standing in the throne room, one hand hooked into his belt and the other stiffly waving in the air as he stated his case before Jonarin, who was sitting on a chair just below the Iron Throne and who looked as if he was not particularly impressed by the performance. Sadly Lord Piglot did not seem to be noticing that fact. He was more fixated on the fact that his suit was firstly one that was set against Lord Kellington, who was not sadly present despite being summoned, and secondly was based on an obscure law of the First Men. Also the bloody man obviously thought about that second point. Renly knew rather different, hence his amusement. Piglot continued to drone on, obviously oblivious to the fact that John was looking at him as if he was wasting his time. His suit was a land ownership matter, not a particularly significant one, but one that he obviously thought that he'd win. The volume under Renly's arm said otherwise. It was a set of notes about legal matters that had been all but codified under Renly, in one of the few things that he had to admit he'd achieved as Master of Laws. He had come to wonder about just what his legacy might be, something that nagged at him. Robert had rediscovered his strength and was doing what he did best: campaign. Yes, he had denounced Cersei's children as bastards, but he'd legitimized 3 of his bastards. House Baratheon had expanded a little, but it was still on the precipice of disaster. Stannis was Robert's heir for the time being and was being a surprisingly good hand. And what was Renly doing? He needed to be the lord of the Stormlands that it needed. The Stormlands were going to war soon. A war on the wall, against creatures out of legend. He wondered what father would have thought of all of this. He had so few memories of him and mother. Piglet, damn it, Piglet was continuing to drone on, and from the drumming of John's fingers on the arm of his chair he was close to telling him to get to the point. And then he heard a door boom open and the sound of boots approaching. Looking to one side he saw a tall man in riding garb, a bandage around his head, with a young man a young woman next to him. A daughter, by the resemblance. Both stopped, bowed to John and then glared more than a little at Piglet, who noticed them and then fell silent for a moment in what seemed to be a genuine moment of shock. "Lord Kellington," John said as he acknowledged him with a nod. "Your presence here is most welcome." "Thank you, Lord Arryn," the man replied. "My apologies for my delay in getting to King's Landing. We were delayed by an attack by would-be outlaws on the road." Renly pricked his ears up at this, as did John. "Would-be, my lord?" "Mendrably dressed but rather too well equipped to be normal outlaws, my lord. We drove them off thanks to my daughter here, who joined me at the last minute with more men." He narrowed his eyes at this. There was something about this matter that made him wonder about the truth of this attack. And then Piglet, damn it, Piglet stepped forwards again. "Lord Arryn, if I may continue to state my case." "You may not," John said in a voice like iron. "Something about it has bothered me for some time now. Lord Baratheon, as Master of Laws, what say you about this case?" John was laying on the formality and he suppressed a smile as he stepped forwards. "Lord Piglet has correctly stated that his suit is based upon a law of the First Men. However, he has not stated the law in full, which is where it fails rather badly." He hefted the book up for a moment. "There have been previous attempts at using this law to satisfy land ownership disputes. Those attempts have always foundered on the complete recitation of said law." Piglet glared. "My lord, I must protest. I have stated the law in full." "Who says I have not?" "A previous Lord Hand, Lord Tywin Lannister." As Renly said the words he could see Piglet go white. "Who stated in these notes that he had been informed on this law by one Lord Shuristone, a noted expert on the laws of the First Men." Piglet seemed to hem and haw a bit over this. "I am not familiar with this Lord Shuristone," he eventually said stiffly. Surely he must have. Whatever he was about to say was forestalled when John raised a hand. "Lord Piglet, I knew Lord Shuristone. We fought together at the Stony September and again at the Trident. He was of the North and knew it and the laws of the First Men very well. Lord Lannister recommended him to me as an expert on those laws." "Lord Baratheon, you say that the full law has not been quoted by Lord Piglet?" "It has not, Lord Arryn. Would you please read the full law?" He did so, in a level voice that hid how much pleasure he was getting from the clear discomfort of the piggish lord in front of him. John drummed his fingers for a long moment on the arm of his chair as he considered. "Lord Piglet, it would seem that your suit against Lord Kellington is much diminished by this." Piglet blustered verbally for a long moment but then, finally nodded reluctantly. "Lord Kellington, what say you?" John called out. "Lord Piglet's suit is entirely diminished by this, if not destroyed," my Lord Kellington snapped as he glared at his adversary. "And I must say that I am somewhat suspicious about the attack upon my party on our way here. These outlaws were very well equipped and were commanded by a young man who fled upon being defeated and who bore a strong resemblance to Lord Piglet. From the way he said that last word he was making a great attempt at pronouncing it correctly. This resulted in more bluster from Piglet, before John cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Enough. Lord Piglet, your suit is denied, as it has no standing in law. Lord Kellington, you own the land whose ownership has been disputed. Please provide further information about the attack against you and your men to my seneschal. It will be investigated." Piglet went even whiter, bowed hurriedly and then all but fled the hall, his men following him. Renly sighed and then strode down to clasp hands with Lord Kellington, who nodded at him and then at the approaching John Arryn. "My lords, my thanks. This has been a most unpleasant affair. Piglet's efforts to gain that land have been annoying." "Piglet, father," his daughter said dryly, and Renly looked at her. She was tall, thin, not in the least buxom, but had a look about her that made him feel confused. She looked at him and then nodded. Lord Baratheon. I am Bethany Kellington. He took her proffered hand, bowed over it and then released it and watched as father and daughter talked with Jon about the matter. Give that man an inch and he tries to take a mile, Jon said eventually. Send word if you have trouble with him again. And Quill will get to the bottom of this attack against you, I promise you. The Kellingtons bowed at this, made their excuses and then strode off. He watched her know them go. He suddenly had much to think about. Jaime. He stayed on the wall for as long as he could. He'd stood guard up there before and listened to people talk about the tricks required to stay warm up there. He knew how to walk about there not too slowly as to get chilled from the wind, but also not too fast as to start to sweat. There were braziers up there as well, where he could warm his hands periodically as he stared north, at the far horizon and the snowy tree-covered hills there. What was lurking in there, under those trees? Where were the others and their whites, what they planning? At least Baratheon's presence in Castle Black had lifted the spirits of his new brothers. The king was on the wall and they knew that Westeros was with them, even bits of Dorne. He sighed a little at that. Things were happening. And every time he looked down into Castle Black and saw a red cloak he sighed a little. He would be around the men of the Westerlands again soon. And Lannisters. His kin. The family he had let down so very badly. There really were times when he had thought about stepping off the wall and ending it all. By the time that the sun started to march down to the west he was getting hungry and knew that he really needed to get down off the wall and get some food. Sleep too. Boots sounded off to one side and then stopped. He paused, sighed and then turned his head. Father was there, dressed in warm clothes and directing as scathing a glare at him as he had ever seen. Tyrion had once said that there were times when father looked at him as if he was dog shit on his boot and now he was directing that same glare against him. He tilted his head back a little and then turned himself. Father, he said, staring back north of the wall. If you're expecting a witty comment from me then you'll be disappointed. This isn't the place for wit. For a moment he felt almost as if he could feel the glare scorch his skin. But then father stepped forwards and turned north as well, looking over the haunted forest. On my way here I thought up almost a score of speeches to throw in your face, of the kind that I threw at her. He said that last word with such venom that Jaime flinched a little. He knew who father was speaking of. There was a long moment of silence. And then, when I caught sight of the wall, all those speeches withered and died, as I realized that I was looking at the place where my eldest son will die. A chill seemed to go through him for a long moment, because that was true. He was going to die here, at some point. There was no way around that. More silence followed. And then father asked, why? Why what? Why did you not tell anyone of the wildfire? And why did you listen to her and do what you did? He stood there for a long moment, feeling the cold wind prickle at the sweat on his brow. I was barely a man when I was appointed to the King's Guard, he said thickly eventually. And just a few years older when I was left in King's Landing after Robb returned and then rode out to the Trident to die. I was alone, no one to truly talk to as I started to realize that Aes had gone completely mad and intended to burn the city to the ground in his mad obsession to become a dragon. I did what I did. And afterwards, when Stark found me in the throne room, his disgust was so strong that I was taken aback. I did not explain why I had done it. What right had a wolf to judge a lion? He looked at father sternly. And every time I tried to talk to you about why I killed the Mad King you brushed me off, you always had a more important meeting to go to. I should have said something, but you were never ready to listen. And yes, I was a fool. I thought that the wildfire would degrade, I truly did. Father's nostrils flared and his mouth worked for a moment as he stared north again. And then he twisted his head and looked away as if to avoid the truth. As for her, he closed his eyes, memories battering at his mind. She was persuasive. I was insulted by people around me. Baratheon didn't love her. It was insanity, I know that now. But at the time, being stuck in the Kingsguard, with no recourse that I could see for, he clenched a hand and then rubbed his forehead briefly. What passed for love? Affection? No, I was a fool. More silence, a horrible and strained moment as they both stared north into the haunted forest. At least you admit to your stupidity, father said eventually, in a hoarse voice. What that stupidity has cost this family, well, you're not that much of a fool not to know. I know. He sighed deeply. How is Tyrion? In Winterfell, with his wife. He has wedded Daisy Sherestone. A weight that he had not really known was there seemed to slide off his shoulders. Good. That was good. I'm glad to hear it. I know how much he loves her. He is also my heir. Father said the words with a level inflection. It is official. Good, he almost spat. You should have done that years ago. He's a better man than I am. Cleverer, too. Father's gloved hands came up to rest on the wall and then curled into fists. I know that now, he said eventually. He is indeed better in every way. I was wrong about him. The silence that fell was the longest one yet. Father broke it. Come on down and get some food. There are plans being made that you need to know of, for this fight on the wall. Father strode off, and after a moment he followed him. Chapter 51. Chapter text. Theon. He wondered how long it would take for the smell of ash to leave his nostrils. The odd thing was that they'd been upwind of the funeral pyre the entire time, but he could still smell the smoke. They'd burned Father's body at first light. There had just been a few there, him, Asher, the Reader, a few lords of the Iron Islands. It had been a time for Ironborn only, or at least those close to the Greyjoys. At least there had been no mutters of Greenlander directed at him, even though that word was now true about him. Anyway, Father's body had been burnt on a pyre, consumed by a fierce blaze that was fueled by lamp oil. Nothing had happened to the body as it had burnt. Thank the old gods. And now he sat with the others in the great hall of Pike as they broke their fast. Boots thumped to one side and Stannis Baratheon joined them, and then a door creaked open and Jon and Ygritte came in. They were holding hands, and there was a look to Jon that he recognized in an instant. Hey! At last. As the two last entrants made their way to the high table, he smirked at his sister. A stag, if you please. She scowled a little at him and then laughed and tossed the coin in the air at him, so that he could snatch it from the air and then wink at Jon, whose face reddened a bit. Lord Harlaw, Jon said eventually after he and Ygritte had sat down and then attacked some warm bread rolls. Who other than drowned men can perform marriage ceremonies on Pike? The Reader, who had been addressing a plate of bacon with some gusto, looked up at this, before leaning back in his chair with a somewhat wry look. Ah. A good question, Lord Jon. Septons tend to be driven away from here on the Iron Islands. As for the old gods, perhaps the Stonerbrows might know on old WYK. He ate some more bacon. Might I ask why you ask that? Oh, he knew. His uncle had a twinkle in his eyes. Jon looked at Ygritte, who openly smirked at him and then whispered something in his ear that made him blush a lot, before looking around the room at them all. Ygritte and I are to marry. As soon as possible. Asher grinned at Ygritte, who grinned back from her seat further down the table. Is there not a heart tree on these islands? The wilderling girl asked after snagging herself some bacon of her own. The Reader laughed softly. Nay, none. Once, maybe, but not now. The drowned men would never have allowed one to exist on these islands. They would have chopped down and burned any that they found, even before Harrenhal started to build Harrenhal with every piece of wood he could find. This made Ygritte look genuinely baffled, and she exchanged a look with Jon, who muttered something about finding someone somewhere to perform the ceremony. He looked intent, and Theon knew exactly why. He wanted a wife, not a lover, and then have legitimate children. No bastards. They all continued eating, and Theon found himself wondering about what lay ahead of them. The trip to Great WYK and the Stonerbrows, and then what next? It had to be back to the mainland and the north. And then the doors opened again, and as he looked up he could feel his jaw drop. Mother. Mother was walking in, on the arm of a man clad in green, with a dark green cloak with horns attached to the hood. A green man. Chairs scraped as he, the Reader and Asher all stood almost as one. Lanny? The Reader asked in an astonished voice. Mother came to a halt and then smiled slightly before curtsying hesitantly. She was still thin, still visibly strained, like butter scraped over too much bread, but there was something different about her. There was a focus and a poise that he hadn't seen before. The last time they'd met, on Harlaw, Mother had been weepy and yet almost distant, as if she thought he was a shade of the past, a ghost, a memory. But now, there was a look in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "My husband is dead," Mother said in a level voice that shook a little at the edges, "and my daughter is now the Lord of the Iron Islands. I am here to support her in every way. And this green man here has helped me to see certain truths at High Harlaw." She looked at Nuncle Roderick. "Certain runes." Nuncle Roderick blanched. "Lanny, the runes are terrible and—" But Mother waved a hand in dismissal. "They confirmed certain feelings I'd had for years." "Years, Roderick? You read a lot. Can you deny that you did not have doubts too?" The reader stood there for a long moment, his face working a little. "I cannot," he said eventually in a hoarse and strained voice. "But we would be fools if we did not acknowledge that there will be others who cling to the old way." He looked at the green man. "And who would you be?" "Alwyn, of the Isle of Faces, my Lord Harlaw," said the man with an accent of the north. "And I am a green man. I am here to meet with the Stonerbrows, who sent a message to the Isle. Old connections must be remade." He stared at the man. "Old connections? What old connections?" He must have muttered the words out loud, because all of a sudden the green man was looking at him. "The Stonerbrows, and others, can tell you the story, but there were always those on the Iron Islands who would send their sons and daughters to the Isle of Faces, when they heard, well, call it a different kind of call. A longing perhaps, or dreams. Word was sent. Word came back. It was quietly done." That made sense, and he nodded slowly as he looked at the man with the green cape and the antlered hood. "There is no godswood on the Iron Islands though." "No," the green man said quietly. "The drowned men were always jealous for their own god. They would never brook any sign of the old ways." He smiled slightly. He seemed to be waiting for something as he and the reader escorted Mother to the table and sat her down, watching as Asher and Theon scrambled to find a plate, cutlery and food for their mother. It wasn't his imagination, she did look better. After a long moment, as Mother ate quietly, Asher looked back at the green man. "Green men normally tend to godswoods. Are you here to plant one? If Lord Harlaw will permit it, perhaps one on Harlaw. But first one on old Wyk. The Stonerbrows and others have waited a long time, their patience must be rewarded. Won't that make them targets?" Theon blurted out the words. "I mean, if they weren't already, surely that will make them doubly so." The green man smiled a little. "I think that there will be those who will defend them, no matter what happens. Winter is coming. As do the others, as you know. Word came of their attack here. Yes, there will be fools who deny it. But more will believe now." He looked at Asher, who looked deeply conflicted. He knew why. Even now, despite everything that she had seen so far, there was still conflict within her. Some roots lay deep. Then she took a deep breath. "After Great Wyk and perhaps Harlaw, we will talk, Alwyn of the Isle of Faces," she said in a troubled voice. "Talk of many things." The green man nodded. But it was John who spoke next. "Alwyn, can you marry people, as a green man? Under the eyes of the old gods?" The man from the Isle of Faces turned and smiled a little. "I can, John Stark." John blinked at this, as did Theon, but then he looked at Ygritte, who was beaming by his side as they both stood. "Then we have a marriage to carry out." Eamon. The arrival of the king had also meant the start of a great many meetings and planning sessions, because the king, the Lord Commander, the First Ranger, the Master of Arms at Castle Black and himself had spent a long time talking the previous night. But then all of that had been about the affairs of the Night's Watch and how the repairs to the castles on the wall were progressing and what else was happening. The other matters, the more personal ones, well, those could only wait until the next day. And now he sat in his study, a cup of moss tea in his hands made by the fiercely protective Jen in his hands, waiting. Craster's widow seemed to have decided that he was in need of her protection. Well, she had her numbers and was surprisingly literate, not that he had pressed her for her full story. She would tell him if she wanted to. Such things needed tact. A brief smile twitched at his lips. Appearances were so illusory were they now at times. She had come to Castle Black as a wilderling, but now she was very much more as she showed off that hidden side of hers. Roses bloomed in the most surprising places at times. A fist pounded against the door and he looked up, The door please, Jen. And then, as we discussed, please leave us. This will probably be His Grace the King. She sniffed, but he had indeed discussed things with her beforehand and she knew that privacy was important now and then walked over to the door to open it. The other side was indeed King Robert, who strode in with a certain hesitancy, nodding at Jen as she curtsied quickly and then slipped out, closing the door behind her. Your Grace, Eamon murmured as he bowed. Be welcome to my study. The king looked about the place, at the ranks of books and papers and nodded choppily at him. Great-grand-uncle Eamon. He pulled a chair out and sank into it, looking strained and troubled, before finally looking him in the eye and sighed. I have already apologized to Ned Stark about this, but I really need to apologize to you above all. I am sorry about Rhaegar's children, they should not have been killed. It was all on Tywin Lannister. He sighed himself. Tywin always was one for the darker gambits of the Game of Thrones. The king ran a large hand over his face. I never thought that I'd ever be king. Just the Lord of the Stormlands, at Storm's End. By the time I got to the Red Keep and saw Tywin Lannister standing next to those bodies, obviously expecting me to be pleased whilst judging me with those cold green eyes of his, I reacted as I thought he'd expect. It wasn't until I saw Ned's face that I realized that it was as wrong could be. I was wrong. I'm sorry. They were kin to me. I never understood Rhaegar. Not many did, he replied wryly. He would write to me, you know. Letters about prophecy and legend and what I knew about the wall and our family. He thought he was touched by something. He thought that there was a destiny he had to fulfill. By the end though, his letters were dark things indeed. He wrote of terrible mistakes he had made. He raped Lyanna Stark, Robert said in a voice like iron. I know what he did. All of it. I know that it sounds strange, but she came to me in a dream, when I was in Winterfell. I know, that sounds mad, but she said that the walls between the living and the dead were thinner there. He looked at him carefully. I have sworn an oath about what Lyanna told me. His voice dropped to a whisper. I know the truth about Ned's son. He is not at risk from me, I have sworn it. After all, his family. A weight he had not known was on him lifted. That was good. You must tell me more about this dream, in time. But first he looked over his desk and grabbed the precious package he had taken out earlier. Please read these, when you have time. Your grandmother wrote to me, often. Letters of humor and wisdom and love. She loved your grandfather fiercely, and of course your father and you and your brothers. As he handed the letters over he could see how much the king was moved, as his face worked and tears appeared in his eyes. I recognize her handwriting, he said softly as a large hand fingered the cover of one of the letters. Gods, but I miss her. She was very proud of you. He took a deep breath. Her letter after Summerhall broke my heart. When Jaehaerys died after just 3 years on the throne she was deeply upset, and then, well, there was Aerys. She often wrote of her worries about him. And she was right to. What he did, he shook his head in distress. I knew from your grandmother's letters that House Targaryen was on the brink of disaster. I hoped that your father's friendship with Aerys would temper him. After he and your mother died, all I had was fear. Especially after Roll died as well. Nothing but fear. There was a long moment of silence in the room as they both stared at the past. And then Aemon said at last, Aerys murdered Rickard and Brandon Stark, after Rhaegar abducted Lyanna Stark. When word came of those crimes, I knew that House Targaryen was doomed. He reached out and grasped the king's forearm. I know that this will surprise you, coming from a man with my name, but you were right to do what you did, to rebel against the Iron Throne. Aerys was mad enough to murder Lord Paramounts and order the deaths of other Lords Paramounts. And Rhaegar was a man obsessed with a prophecy that he did not understand and which led him down a dark road indeed. Even your father would have rebelled. Robert Baratheon looked into his eyes for a long moment and then nodded choppily. Thank you. Yes, I know what you mean. He sighed gustily. In the meantime I have much to do here, whilst trying to work something out. We met giants on the way here and they said that I was the man who brought storms with him, whilst Lyanna said that I need to let her go and become the Storm King I was destined to be. He spread his hands in bafflement. How? Is it a Durandan thing that is tied to Stormbreaker? Is it more complicated than that, involving my Targaryen blood? Is it prophecy, something I don't want to touch with a bloody barge pole because of Rhaegar and his madness? He leant back and pondered matters for a long moment. There is much to discuss there and much for me to research. And I will do my best to give you answers. My very best. Robert smiled at him after a long moment. Thank you. One last thing, the Green Man says that we will need Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons. That might mean that House Targaryen becomes a part of Westeros again, somewhere. We should discuss where and how she should be approached. His face worked again. I have doubts, but I am willing to think matters over. Apparently she vanished after Pentos fell to the Bravo Sea, but I'm sure she's out there somewhere. She has 3 dragons after all. She too has a destiny. A little more weight fell from his shoulders. I agree, my king. He paused. Your grandmother would have been very proud of you, right now. The king chuckled. Ned once told me that I always find my way back to the true path eventually. After prodding. Mayhaps he's right. Another sigh. I lost my way before, Eamon. Please help keep me on the right path now. And so he reached out and clasped hands with Rol's grandson. Robb. Bran always had the same look whenever mother brought him into father's solar for his daily lessons. It was a look that combined dread with sullen sulkiness. He knew that the lessons about the North could be dull, but it wasn't dull enough to make his little brother slump in such a way. Bran, he said eventually, you need to learn this. His brother just glowered at him for a long moment. Why? It was remarkable how much wine he could put into one word. You need to know about how the North is run. You need to know about which house is which, what relationship they have with House Stark, what their local rivals are, which friends they have, what they trade, what they grow, what's changed and so on. A lot's changed after the Company of the Rose came back and started to reunite with their kin or rebuild from scratch. You have to learn all of this. But I'm never going to rule the North. Your father's heir, and then Jon and Sansa and Arya. He sighed. Bran, father was never supposed to rule the North, Uncle Brandon was. No one imagined that he and grandfather would die in the way that they did. And that's why you need to learn, especially as you're the heir after me. Sansa and Arya are girls, and although Jon has been legitimized, he follows Rickon in the succession. His brother scrunched his forehead. But that's stupid, he muttered. Jon's older than me. Sansa knows more than me. Arya's a better walk than me. It's the way it is, Bran. Boys before girls and bastards after the legitimate children. Bran glowered again. It is the way. Stupid way. He returned to the books, but Robb could tell from the side glances he was giving him that there was something on his little brother's mind. Eventually he looked at Bran. What's wrong? Bran looked shifty. Are you still looking for something here in Winterfell? Yes. He smiled thinly. I have no idea what, but the Green Man told me to look. That said, it might be more about the journey than the destination, as I've been looking at a lot of books about the earliest days of Winterfell. From the look of bemusement on the face of his brother, the last point had sailed far, far over his head, so Robb sighed yet again and then asked, why do you ask? The shifty look intensified. Well, Bran said, and then he was interrupted by a knock on the door, which opened to reveal Maester Lewin with a message scroll in one hand. Your pardon, Lord Robb, but you need to see this at once. The old man strode over and held the message out, which Robb took, read and then repressed a groan over. Ah, he said eventually. So Alekhine and Delaena Florent are on their way to Winterfell. Lewin, could you please pass the word to my mother and Sir Courtney Penrose that I need to see them at once? Lewin coughed a little and then slid his hands up his sleeves in the way that he did at certain times. I took the liberty of anticipating your orders as I came here and have already done so. He smiled at the Maester. Lewin was an absolute gem at times. And it wasn't long before he heard the sound of footfalls and voices in the corridor outside before Mother and Sir Courtney arrived, their faces curious, and he stood to greet them. Mother, Sir Courtney. This just arrived. He handed over the message and then watched as Mother held it so they both could read and then react to with slight grimaces. I've been expecting this, Sir Courtney said eventually. ever since word went out of Edric's legitimization. The Florents will be here in numbers and his mother will want to make sure that he remembers that he's half Florent. Those foxes aren't stupid. They are both cousins to Lady Baratheon, are they not? Robb asked as he dredged up what he knew about the Reach. Will she welcome them, given Edric's new status? Mother tapped the message against her chin as she considered the matter. Perhaps. The fact that Stannis is formally Robert's heir at the moment, until a later decision is made, might complicate matters. I don't know enough about the Florents to guess otherwise. Based on this message, they won't be here for some weeks. They are sailing to White Harbor and then riding from there, so it should depend on tides and winds. I'll talk to Edric, Sir Courtney said gruffly. Tell him that his mother is on the way. He pulled a slight face. The Tyrells won't like this much. I know, Mace Tyrell is dead and Willers Tyrell has a head on his shoulders, but the Florents have always had a better claim to Highgarden than the Tyrells, and it's foolish not to admit that they won't look on Edric as a possible threat. With your permission, Lord Robb, I'll have a word with Sir Roderick Castle about security. Robb nodded and the Stormlander inclined his head and walked out, leaving him looking at Mother. Could you have a word with Lady Baratheon, Mother? She's difficult to talk to at times. The ghost of a smile crept over Mother's face. She is indeed. I shall talk to her and will be most careful in my use of words. Lewin, how goes her pregnancy? Maester Lewin visibly weighed his words. It progresses well, my lady. I am watching carefully what she eats and how much she does, and am telling her why as I do so. The North seems to agree with her so far in terms of her health, and I am wondering what the noxious airs of Dragonstone might have done to her in terms of her past pregnancies. He paused. I am also talking to various servants to keep an eye on who serves her food, noting who remains who served the former queen. I recognize that this might seem a trifle paranoid, but promised Lady Baratheon that I would do my best to see her pregnancy to a successful conclusion, and I intend to keep my word. He blinked a bit at the intent manner in which the Maester spoke, but then realized his wisdom and nodded. As Mother and Lewin departed, talking softly, he leant back in his chair and then he looked at Bran, who had been watching the whole thing with a look of extreme impatience. Can I go and talk to Edric about this? His mother's coming. Robb directed what he hoped was a quelling look at his little brother, who deflated a bit. Bran, you need to finish your studies for today. This is something you need to work on every day. His brother rolled his eyes and then sighed in a highly exaggerated manner, but then returned to the books. After a moment he looked up. Robb, what I was saying about you still looking for something, I think that I might. There was a knock on the door and they both looked up to see Jory Castle at the entrance. Beg pardon, Lord Robb, but there's a party of wild free folk in the Great Hall. The Lady Val says that her mother is here. He stood so quickly that Grey Wind jerked upright in a rush from his slumber with Summer and looked around for whatever enemy had alarmed his owner. Bran jerked back in his seat as well, until Robb gestured at the books. Keep reading. And then he strode out with Jory at his side and Grey Wind at his heels. As they reached the door to the courtyard he looked at Jory. Find Moore's Umber, if you please, Jory. There were indeed free folk in the Great Hall, with 5 men in their distinctive bronze armor acting as escorts. Some of the free folk looked a bit bewildered, some looked curious, and then there was the tallish woman who looked about the hall with a combination of familiarity and unease. Val and Dalla were standing next to her, looking happier than he had seen them look for some time. As he approached, Val glanced at him and then turned to face him. Lord Robb, this is our mother, Rowan. Rowan looked at him with eyes that had widened a bit, and then she curtsied in a way that made some of the other free folk look at her in a rather bewildered manner. Well now. She knew her courtesies. We expected you a week or more ago, Dalla said with a slight frown of concern. Is anything amiss? I was delayed, Rowan replied softly. There was much to see and, well, there were many people on the road. That seemed a thin excuse and he eyed her carefully. You've been here before, he said in a low voice that made Val and Dalla both stare at him. Winterfell is not new to you, is it? Rowan stared at the ceiling, the floor and her daughters, before looking at him with what seemed to be tears in her eyes. I never thought I'd ever see it again, she said in a choked voice, and that really made her daughters stare at her in shock. Mother? Val asked in a voice that made her sound as if she was trying to hold a lot back. And then in a rush, "What do you mean, ma'am?" But before Rowan could reply another voice spoke. "I thought you were dead." Mors Umber was in the nearest doorway, Jory next to him, the one-eyed man's face as white as a sheet. "I chased after the Horsens who took you, I went beyond the wall looking for you, I thought that you were dead." His face worked in agony, memories chasing across his features. Rowan's face fell as she closed her eyes for a long moment and then she faced Mors Umber. "Father. I thought you were dead." "I almost was." Her face worked for a long moment. "You almost found me." "He had a knife to my throat, 10 miles north of the wall. You were there with 50 men, all mounted. I was about to knee the Horsen who took me in the balls, but he knocked me out first." Mors Umber closed his eyes as if in agony. "I thought I heard something at the time, but my men thought otherwise. God's fucking damn it." He took a step towards her, almost hesitantly. "Rowan." She burst into tears and then ran into his arms, as Robb marveled at the change in the huge man. He'd always viewed him as the drunk brute of the Umbers, but here he was, looking as if he was about to burst into 1,000 pieces with emotion. "Why didn't you come home sooner? Did that Horsen have you chained up?" Rowan Umber smiled a savage smile. "He died, father. Hard to breath after you have your freshly severed cock and balls stuffed down your throat." The hall echoed with the sound of Mors Umber's laughter. "That's my girl." Then he looked at his daughter. "I take it that there's a but then." "But then I met a better man." "Their father," she said, gesturing at a visibly gobsmacked Val and Dalla. "Gywyn, his name was. A good man. I gave him 2 daughters and a stillborn son. And then he died, in a fight against the others. Mance Raider, Dalla's husband, said that he cut Gwyn's head off his shoulders after he was dead so that he couldn't be raised again as a white." Mors Umber looked at the 3 women for a long moment and then he drew his daughter close to him again and kissed the top of her head. "I've a lot to think about," he said eventually in a husky voice. "I've always hated fucking wildlings after they took you. But now, I'll think about it all. My daughter is returned to me and I'll not forget that, Lord Robb. And I have granddaughters. One's married to bloody Mance Raider and the others," he looked at Robb fiercely. "Treat her right, boy. Treat her right. Or I'll have something to bloody say to you." He nodded to the hulking man and then he looked at Val, who had a look on her face that combined shock with sudden hope. "I will leave you to talk to your family. Umbers, all. Val, Dalla, Umber." He nodded formally and then looked at Val. "We must talk. We will talk." She said the words with utter finality. And the look in her eyes. He had to be careful now. So careful. There was something precious hanging in the air and he could not jeopardize it. So he nodded again and then strode off, almost in a daze, back to Father's solar. When he reached it he could see that Bran was somehow still sitting there and almost vibrating with tension. "What happened?" "Val's mother, Rowan, is in Winterfell, Bran. And she's Mors Umber's daughter." His brother absorbed that. "So Val's an Umber?" "Yes." "Are you going to marry her?" He considered that. "Perhaps. If she says yes." Bran sat there for a long moment. "So things are happening." He frowned slightly. "Yes." "What do you mean?" Bran sighed and scowled at the same time. "Robb. I've been trying to tell you something. There's a door in the crypts. A door, that you can only see when you walk. Is that important?" He sat there for a long moment as all his dreams of a fast marriage to Val hit the obstruction of Bran's words. "Say what again?" "Jaime." He was tired of the way that Father's men avoided him now. They eyed him as if he was diseased. Oh, if one of them had to speak to him, to pass on a message that Father wanted to talk to him, they did that quickly and curtly, but on the whole they regarded him a cursed man who had brought shame to the Lannister name and to the Westerlands and who would die here on the wall. Which was all quite true. Adam Marbrand, his old friend, was among the men and so far he had successfully avoided him. He had no wish to see Adam turn his glance away from him, to look embarrassed at where the former Golden Lannister of the Kingsguard was now. So he'd spent time up on the wall and training Joffrey in some out of the more out-of-the-way places. His son had been sulky and distracted, obviously thinking about his old life and how unfair everything was now that he was no longer Prince Joffrey Baratheon and now merely Joffrey Hill. He needed to have a quiet word with father about making sure that Joffrey didn't persuade a Lannister guardsman to help him. No Lannister could abandon their vows, not now. Grandson or not, father would not stand for it. And now he was sitting in a corner of the main hall of Castle Black, looking down at some boar sausages in a stew that was actually quite tasty. Fresh crusty bread too. Toelette had told him that the food had improved since the call. Compared to what he was used to, it was tolerable. And then a hand fell on his shoulder and someone sat down next to him as he ate his stew. Startled, he looked at the fellow and froze. Adam. Cornered you at last. Adam said with a scowl. You can't run off or skulk away around a corner because you saw me. His old friend looked him up and down. The beard suits you for this location, you're a bit skinny, you look like shit and you're an idiot. There, I've got that off my chest. He sat there for a moment, almost choking with emotion at the words of his oldest friend. Adam. Whaff. Adam said through a mouthful of stew. You. I'm not a popular man and... Adam's free hand smacked against his chest. Piss on that. Do you really think that I'm a fair-weather friend? That I'd turn my back on oldest friend, just because you're on the wall now after doing something truly stupid? Gods, Jaime, what did you take me for? He wanted to put his hands over his face and cry for a moment, but he pushed it back. Thank you, Adam, he said eventually. Thank you. Adam looked about the room carefully and then lowered his voice. Gods, what a mess. I talked to Tyrion in Winterfell before we left, he sent his best and asked me to give you this. A letter emerged from his jerkin and Jaime took it with a smile. Before you ask, he's doing well. Very happy with that wife of his. I'm not sure which of the two them reads the more. A good match. He looked down at the letter, which had his name on it in Tyrion's bold and distinctive hand. I'm glad he's happy. His oldest friend smiled at him and then addressed the sausages in his stew again. After a moment of chewing he glanced up again. I'm surprised you haven't had your jaw dragging on the ground about the other people here. Jaime felt his brow furrow. Who do you mean? The king. My father. Adam stopped eating and directed a very odd look at him. I know that you've been on the wall a lot and teaching Joffrey not to chop his foot off, but you must have heard that he looked around as two people walked into the room and made for the head table. He was in Castle Black. He looked around. The man was older than he was and looked like. Is that the Blackfish? He blurted the words with some astonishment. Sir Brynden Bloody Tully. Gods. He stared at him and frowned a bit. He's younger than I thought. And who's he with? At first he'd thought that the Blackfish's companion was a young man, but no, despite the leathers of a man, he was a she. Tall, blonde, not pretty, but a lively face and clear blue eyes. Who is she? Brienne of Tarth, the Evenstar's daughter. And I have no idea what it is between the two of them. They both have green cloaks and the same clasp like a horn, and before you ask, yes, the Blackfish has less grey in his hair than I remember, and no, they are not a couple. Or perhaps not yet. He watched as the odd pair sat and then started to eat after helping themselves to food. The Blackfish. The bloody Blackfish. Remember when we used to blatter at each other with wooden blades when we were boys? Adam smiled wryly. You wanted to be as good a fighter as the Blackfish, a knight as good as he. We lived for the tales of him in the War of the Ninepenny Kings. Him or Sir Duncan the Tall. Gods, the arguments we had over who was better. And now they are both here. Jaime shook his head slightly. Both. I don't understand. Adam eyed him again. You did hear that the Green Man is here, didn't you? Oh, that. He shrugged. I heard that the call had brought out a few green men from their island. Or so someone said. I didn't believe it. They never leave the Isle of Faces. Adam gaped at him, giving a view of a half-chewed sausage. Then he hurriedly chewed and swallowed. Oh, he said eventually. They left all right. The call released them. Did you hear it? The call. He shook his head. Not really. There was a dream, I think, and I felt something, But no, I didn't hear it. Did you? His old friend went still, his face working for a moment. Do you remember how we once talked about how old Ashmark is, how there was a castle beneath the castle? It must have been old. Yes, my father and I heard the call. Father sent help to the wall as soon as he could. It was like nothing I've ever experienced. There was a moment of silence as Adam seemed to go away somewhere in his own mind. And then he shook himself and returned. But that's not as important as this. Jamie, the Green Man isn't just any Green Man. He's the Green Man, the head of his order, if you can call it that. There's tales of him battling the Faith Militant with the Blackfish and Brian of Tarth by the shores of the God's Eye. And before he was the Green Man he was Sir Duncan the Tall. This was ridiculous and Jamie threw his old friend a disbelieving look. Adam, are you drunk? Sir Duncan the Tall died at Summerhall. No, said Adam with a shake of his head. He was injured there. Gods, you should see his arm and the burns on it. But he lived and became the Green Man. Don't ask me how he's lived this long, I couldn't tell you. Something to do with the Isle of Faces and old gods. But it's him. Your father says it's him. Something cold seemed to run up and down his spine for a moment and he wanted to shiver as he looked about. It was insane, this tale, but if Adam said that father said it was true. Gods. Then he paused. Why had father not told him about this? Oh, they had talked in a desultory manner after their meeting on the wall, but it had not been a real talk, not really. Father was not good at small talk. He shook his head again and then readdressed his stew and the sausages within. I feel like we're living in a song, a tale, a legend. Adam snorted a little. We'll be fighting legends. Myths, I might have said once. But now. After seeing those cages with those heads and hands. We're fighting for everyone south of us. Everyone in West Eos. Well, said a deep voice behind them rumbled and they both jumped a little and turned in their seats. There was a tall man standing behind them, dressed in green leathers and with a deeper green cloak that had a hood with what looked like antlers draped on his shoulders. He was old, slightly bent, but there was a look about him that told Jamie that he had seen a lot of fighting and retained a lot of vigor. This was no weak old man. There was also a weighing, considering, look to his glance as he eyed Jamie that made him feel most uneasy indeed. Sir Duncan, Adam said thickly after a moment. How fare you? Well, Sir Adam, the Green Man said after a moment. And you are Sir Jamie Lannister? He said as fact, not as a question. Jamie flushed a little and stood to bow slightly. Sir Duncan. Now that he could see him closer he could notice that he fitted the description he'd read. Even seen a picture of once. His skin crawled with the madness of it all. The Green Man observed him for a long moment and then smiled the merest of half smiles. Come and see me in 2 days, Sir Jamie, you and I have a journey north of the wall to plan out. He nodded to them both and then strode away to the same table as the Blackfish and Brian of Tarth, leaving the two men gaping at his back. Jamie eventually closed his mouth and sat down heavily, Adam mirroring his actions. He had yet another feeling that his life was about to change. Robb. It looked like a stone wall, stone laid on stone with the merest hint or mortar every now and then. There were runes carved in paces on the topmost course of stones and also on the lowest course, but it was otherwise an unremarkable wall in the crypts, in a passageway that led towards the lower and older levels of tombs of long-dead Starks. And there was no doorway there that he could see. He looked at Bran, who was biting his lip and looking like a boy who was either worried that he wasn't being believed, or needed a piss, or both. Summer on the other hand was sitting next to Bran with a look of utter unconcern. Here? Robb asked. You're sure, Bran? Here? Bran said firmly. I'm sure. How did you even see them whilst watching? Bran looked at him whilst he knotted his fingers together briefly. I was looking for Vermix's eggs, he admitted eventually. The king said that they weren't likely to be in here, as it's narrow and Vermix was big, but we thought that perhaps if Vermix really squeezed up and narrowed out then, he caught sight of Robb's upraised eyebrow and sighed. I know. But I wondered if Summer might be able to see something that I couldn't, so I walked into him and looked and didn't see a thing until I got here. There's a big door here. Or at least it looked big to Summer. He's still small. Robb looked back at the wall and then glanced at Grey Wind, who was staring at the space that Bran had pointed at. The direwolf had his head quirked to one side as if puzzled by something. "Walk into Grey Wind and see, Robb." Bran sounded excited and he repressed a sigh. Warging was still something that he was getting used to, even with regular practice. Bran and Arya and yes even Sansa seemed to be far more adept at it than he was so far, even if the latter had been a little unsure about at first, due to the lingering remains of Septa Mordane's strictures. Speaking of whom, Septa Mordane had been talking about going south of the Neck to the Isle of Faces. Mother was still trying to puzzle through her reasons, but it was clear that Mordane's feet were on a different path than before. So he sighed a little, sat down opposite the wall, his back against the other wall and then half closed his eyes and sent his mind into that other place where he could start to grasp his way through, too. All of a sudden he was off to one side, feeling smaller but furrier, and he made a note to try and remember that all of a sudden he had no arms but 4 legs. He blinked and then looked at his own body, which was sitting there with white and unblinking eyes. He looked at Bran, who was looking excitedly at him and at the wall, where he took a step back. There was a door there. There really was a door. He stared at it. There was a join in the middle were stone, like the stones around it, with carvings that stretched up and over the top that looked like the trunk and branches of a tree. At the curve at the top he could see an arch of runes and he scowled a little. They were archaic. And then he looked down. There were 3 sets of handprints. They looked like slight depressions, 6 of them, and the middle ones were smaller than the others and looked a bit different from the others, although he wasn't sure why. A moment of confused impressions and then he was back in his own body and standing hurriedly and running his hands over what felt like a smooth wall. "Gods," he muttered, before standing back. "I saw it but can't feel it. Magic. It must be magic." "Did you see it?" Bran asked with excitement running through his voice. "You saw it, didn't you?" He turned and grinned at his brother, before ruffling his hair, provoking an indignant squawk from him. "I saw it. There's a set of double doors here, with runes over the top and places for hands. Odd." He looked back at the wall and ran his hand over his chin. "Most odd. Do you think that Vermix's eggs are behind it?" Instead of rolling his eyes, Robb instead made himself look patiently at his little brother. "Bran, the runes are in the language of the First Men and there's no reference at all to them in any record. They're old. When Jaehaerys Valerian was here with Vermix, I doubt the doors were open." He looked back at the wall. "No, these are truly old. And we need help on this." Almost as if in answer to his last words he heard distant footsteps approaching and then Jory appeared, looking as if he had been running. Seeing his face, Robb straightened. "Jory, what's the matter?" "Word from the Iron Islands, Lord Robb," Jory panted. "Balon Greyjoy is dead and the Lord Hand wrote that there was an attack by the others on Pike." Shock froze him in place for a long moment and then he shook himself free of it all. "What? Are you sure?" "How?" "Maester Lewin has 2 ravens with the same message, Lord Robb. All I know is that the attack was a failure, thanks to Lord Jon and Lord Greymist, as well as the Lord Hand. Asha Greyjoy is the new lord, or perhaps Lady of the Iron Islands. Bran, take Summer and go back to the courtyard. I'll talk to Tyrion and Daisy about what we found. The runes will need to be translated." He could see Jory frown in puzzlement and he gestured at him. "Never mind that, Jory. Where is Maester Lewin?" "Lord Stark's Solar, Lord Robb. I was one of many sent to find you." He nodded and then, with Grey Wind at his heels, he ran. "Others, on Pike. How? And how much time did they now have?" Oberyn. He'd never thought that he'd be grateful to see the wall in his life, but he was glad to see it now, that line of white on the horizon. They'd be there by that afternoon, if this wind held true, and as Seaworth had said that it would, then he saw no reason to doubt that. If Stannis Baratheon, the tooth-grinding stubborn fool that he was, did not know that Sir Davos Seaworth was a gem of a man, albeit a rough one, then he was an absolute imbecile. There had been 3 times when Seaworth had ordered a change in course that had probably saved all of their lives. The first time had been 4 days after departing King's Landing. He had been quietly talking to Seaworth about their course when the man had stiffened suddenly, literally sniffed the air, looked at the pennant at the mainmast and then recalled where he was, nodded formally to him, begged his pardon and then said that there was a squall coming and that they needed to change course. Bemused, he had said yes immediately, whereupon Seaworth had started to bark out orders and then oversee the flags needed to communicate those orders, so that the flotilla changed course enough to hug the coast of a particularly unattractive and rocky part of the southern Vale. Shortly after a squall had indeed turned the sea to white mist off to the east, where they would have otherwise been sailing. If they had been in that spot they would have been in desperate trouble, or even a puff of green fire. Afterwards he had simply looked at Seaworth and said that if he ever sensed the same thing he was to shout orders first and ask his permission second, as his dignity, in this case at least, was less important than dying in an instant because of the wildfire exploding due to a rope not being pulled on at the right moment. And then there had been that one, truly odd, moment. As they had been sailing north at one point he and others in the crew had heard what sounded like a deeply submerged voice moaning a single repeated word, "Beware." As a man with ties to Essos he had a feeling that he might know what had been bellowing the word. As they sailed on he frowned and then scampered up the rigging to the crow's nest with his mirrorish spyglass, before focusing and then squinting. Only then did he allow himself the luxury of a grin. "Deck there," he bellowed. Far below he could see the helmsman and Seaworth next to him. "Look up. East watch by the sea in sight just 3 degrees off the port side." Waves acknowledged his words and he shimmied down the rigging and joined Seaworth as he bellowed orders and arranged for signal flags to be hoisted. It was all excitingly nautical and he hoped that he'd be able to dock himself with someone who had a nice tight opening as soon as they made landfall. By the time that they finally beat into the harbour at Eastwatch by the sea he was thanking the notes that Sarala had sent him about what to wear this far north. Mother Rowan's tits, but was it cold up here? There was a reception committee waiting for them at the docks, led by a short, lean, man with a widow's peak and a bit of a beard. As the gangplank went down and Seaworth leant over the railing the man stepped forwards. "Still alive then, Seaworth?" "Oh, aye, still alive, Pike." There was a moment of silence and then the two men both grinned as Seaworth strode down the gangplank and embraced the other man. "You old whoreson, how are you?" "Still alive, despite the dead." Pike's face sobered. "You've brought a load of Aes Targaryen's madness then, as was ordered." Seaworth nodded, before gesturing at Oberyn. "We have. Cotter Pike, this is Prince Oberyn Martell of Dawn, who has made it safe for now. I trust you have a place for it." Pike nodded shortly. "Aye, as ordered. Grand Maester Pycelle's instructions have been followed to the fucking letter, or so I'm told. We've built a building that should take it all safely." "Thank you," Pike Oberyn said formally. "It should be safe for 2 days or so, as we have used certain powders on it when we left King's Landing." The bearded man nodded with a grimace. "Horrible fucking stuff. But that said, it should be useful against those blue bastards and their unliving ranks." "What's the latest word?" Oberyn asked intently. "All the wildlings, or those of them who are still alive, are now south of the wall," said Pike grimly. "The giants too. It was a good thing we got to Hardham with those ships when we did. 10 days later the place got walloped by a snowstorm that you wouldn't believe. I saw it on the horizon as we sailed away with the last of the wildlings and I swear it got colder faster than I've ever known as it came close. Not that they had anyone at Hardham left to raise into a white. All the wildlings were gone and their dead were burnt. The ice drake skeletons too." "Ice drakes?" Oberyn asked, his eyebrows shooting up. "I thought that they were a myth and, oh. As much a myth as the others and their whites." "I saw those skeletons," Prince Oberyn the man in black replied somberly. "I don't know if there are any alive now, but there were once. Explains a lot about Hardham and how it might have died. But no news otherwise." Seaworth asked shrewdly. "No assault on the wall?" "Nothing," said Pike with sounded like relief. "Which is good, men, and women. And supplies come in every day on ships from all over West Eos. But we're still repairing the castles west of us here and the gift and new gift will take time to start producing food again, even with all them wildlings." There was a way that he almost spat that last word that spoke volumes about the way that he really felt about them. That said, the man was obviously trying to repress those thoughts. He thought about twisting his tail a butt, but then decided that such a thing would be a bit petty. Which reminds me, there's a letter for you, Prince Oberyn. From a maester called Alras, or something like that. He pulled out a rectangle of waxed leather with its edges stitched together that had his full name written on it, and he took it with a mutter of thanks. Sir Davos, I'll read this whilst you get the ships organized with Commander Pike here. The Black Brother looked a bit confused at the title, but then Seaworth started to talk and lead him away, and as they left, Oberyn pulled out his smallest knife and attacked the stitching. Inside was indeed a letter, and he pulled it out with fingers that were just a little clumsy due to the gloves he was wearing. Yes, it was from Sorrela, and he frowned at the news she had listed. She seemed to have written it in installments as news came in and then sent it, quite recently, from Castle Black. So, Jaime Lannister had indeed taken the Black, as had been reported, and was on the wall. That whoreson Tywin Lannister must have choked on that, as well as the fact that the dwarf was now his heir. He bore no ill will towards the man, not with the memories he had of Cersei making him cry as a baby because she was a creature of hate and bile, and he would make a far better lord of the Westerlands than his brother could ever dream of being. He wondered what Doran was thinking now that Robert Baratheon was single again and obviously looking for a wife. Did he have a plan for Arianne? Well, if so, he had reservations about sending another Martell anywhere near King's Landing. And what was this bit about runes and making them glow by carving them on 2 bronze bits of armor with bronze tools whilst praying to the old gods? He chewed a lip briefly. Interesting. He'd have to try that. But then the hurried scroll at the end of the pages rose off the paper and hit him between the eyes. The mountain was dead. The monster who had haunted his dreams for so long, the man he had imagined killing in oh so many endlessly inventive ways, was dead. He wanted to exult that Elia was finally avenged and then scream with frustration that he had not killed him with his own bare hands. There had long been a vial of manticore poison that he had wanted to test on Sir Gregor fucking Clegane. But now the man was dead at the hands of Robb Stark and Sandor Clegane. And in such circumstances, possessed by foul magic, probably Valyrian at that, was the verdict in Winterfell, and he had to say that he couldn't disagree. He searched his mind for any mentions of such magic in his time in Essos. There had been a mention, briefly, in Volantis about the great deeds of Valyria. He'd been at a gathering where it had been the fashionable thing to talk about the Valyrians and the things that they could do, things that on reflection were enough to make anyone with any sense shudder. Yes, just because something could be done did not mean that it should be done. He'd heard things about Gogossos that had given him nightmares. So, someone had possessed the mountain. Who? And why? Which Stark had been marked for death, and again why? He slid the letter into a pocket and then strode off to rejoin the others. He had a lot to do and a lot to now think about. As soon as the wildfire was properly secured, he'd head for Castle Black. For one thing, he didn't like the way that his daughter wrote about this Illyrian Lannister. He might be Ser Gerion Lannister's son, who liked to stick 2 fingers in the general direction of his brother, but he was still a Lannister. Chapter 52. Chapter text. Domeric. Luckily Sansa had been with him when the message had arrived that Robb wanted to see him at once, that there had been some sort of an attack by the others on the Iron Islands. His beloved could be trusted to make sure that his lute wasn't dropped or unstrung or mistreated in any way. There were times when he could see Arya looking at it in a considering way, as if she was pondering mischief with it. He hurried down the corridor towards Lord Stark's solar, nodded at Jory Castle, who was outside it panting slightly, and then went in. Robb was inside, staring at the map of Westeros on the wall, with a pale Lady Stark to one side and a scowling Tyrion Lannister on the other, whilst Daisy Lannister was off to one side consulting a large book. "Robb, you sent for me." The heir to Winterfell nodded and handed over a raven message, which Domeric unscrolled. As he read the words, he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The others attacked Pike. How is that possible? Robb gestured at the raven message and he kept reading. They used icebergs, with the others and their whites embedded within them. How is that even possible? They're not human, Tyrion Lannister said as he continued to stare at the map. We need to stop thinking of them as human adversaries. They have resources and magics that we do not understand, or have forgotten about. Too much time has passed since we last knew them. They became legends and stories and we dismissed them as such. However, Daisy. Anything in that? His wife looked up from the book. Nothing. There has never been an attack by the others that bypassed the wall in such a way, or none that was ever recorded. Humph. Tyrion smiled his thanks at his wife, who smiled back, and then returned his gaze to the map. Domeric swapped a glance with Robb and joined him there. Why Pike? Tyrion almost snapped. Why there? No other reports of attacks, or at least so far, so why there? Robb tilted his head to one side as his eyes swept the map. Any number of reasons, he said eventually. A reconnaissance in force. A trial, to see if it could be done. An attempt to create a lodging on a place that would have been utterly unprepared for them, if it hadn't been for Jon, Theon and Ygritte, as well as the Lord Hand. Or, it might have been something to do with the madman, Euron Greyjoy. Domeric shivered slightly as he looked at the message again. Euron Greyjoy had killed one brother and fatally wounded another. Kinslayer. Cursed by every god. He squinted at the small writing at the bottom of the message. Your brother writes that Euron Greyjoy vanished after the attack. How is that possible? And what's this about wanting to replace the drowned god? Robb shook his head in bafflement. I know not. But I don't like the fact that he said that he had allied himself with the others. As to the drowned god, well, There was a thump at the door, which opened to reveal a panting Maester Lewin. My lords, my lady. Another message from Lord Jon. He held out twin scrolls and Robb snatched one out of his hand and unrolled it in front of him, whilst Lewin gave the other to Lady Stark and Dacey. The writing was tiny and there was much of it as the scroll could take, but as he read it Domeric could feel his eyebrows arch upwards. Madness, he breathed eventually. Sorceress, madness. A cursed ship and a creature made of blood and bones, or what Jon thought was such a thing. Robb shook his head in horror. Why? Was it Euron Greyjoy's crew? Who else would make such a thing? Tyrion Lannister raised a finger, his eyes tightly closed and everyone stared at him as his face showed the deepest of calculations. Lewin. The word burst from his mouth and made everyone jump. The Book of Valyrian Practices. It mentioned the work of flesh smiths, did it not? The terrible spells that my uncle Gerion might have seen, the evidence of the kind of horrors that Gogossos might have held, did it not? Lewin nodded with a look of revulsion, but Tyrion kept on wagging his finger. And that story of what Ned and Jon faced at Barrowtown, the things in the fog, made from bone. We know that Euron Greyjoy has been voyaging all over the world, perhaps even to the Smoking Sea. What if he picked up knowledge from Valyria and then combined it with something he learned from the others? He found that the sensation of blood draining from one's face was a singular one that was not very nice. As he looked at the others in the room he realized that they too were feeling the same sensation. Euron Greyjoy possessed the mountain. Dacey said the words in horror. But which Stark was he aiming for? If not Robb, then who? And why? Ned. Lady Stark was ashen. He's gone south to deal with the gate at the High Tower. Where the drowned god is. It must be he that Euron Greyjoy is targeting. We must warn him. She staggered, close to being overwrought, and was deftly caught by Dacey and Lewin, who escorted her to a chair, the Maester then scurrying over to the table to give her a little wine in a cup. Euron Greyjoy intends to replace the drowned god, or steal enough of his powers to become a god, Tyrion breathed. Lewin, is Lady Stark all right? The Maester inspected her face for a moment and then nodded slightly. I think a sleeping draught after this though. Can someone else send your fastest raven to the High Tower? Lewin nodded. I, Lord Tyrion. The heir to Casterly Rock caught the eyes of the heir to Winterfell and the heir to the Dread Fort. Then we have a vitally important message to write. Now. He paused. And we'll use the second and third fastest to the High Tower as well. Ned must be warned in time. Gendry. He stood at the door to the forge and looked out at Castle Black as it started to come awake that morning. There were certain things that had to be done of a morning, and one of those things was to light the forge. Or rather the first forge. There were 3 of the buggers now, and he thanked the gods for Lord Stark, who had arranged a steady supply of coal to Castle Black and the other castles as they were restored. He was, well, he didn't know how he felt right now. Too many names. He was just about starting to get used to being called Gendry Baratheon, but that wasn't all that he was being called. He was called Gendry Strongarm by some, Gendry Runesmith by others, that bastard boy by yet others, gods. He was tired of it all. He was certainly tired of avoiding Joffrey Bloody Hill. The brat obviously still seemed to be pissed off at his very existence, let alone his new name and the fact that father praised him so widely because of his rune carving abilities, which was a bit daft because Maya had discovered them as well. Well, at least he wasn't trying not to be noticed by anyone in Lannister Red anymore. Yes, many of them tended to look down their noses at him, but it seemed that the old lion had made it clear that any more unfortunate events like the attack on Robb Stark by the little ponce back at Winterfell would not be tolerated. The old lion was one scary fucker. What was also scary was the weight that was on him right now, a weight that he worried about. He'd talked about to Lord Royce 2 nights previous, about how much he admitted that he didn't know about making runes, about how he was afraid of making an error. What were the rules about rules? What did they mean exactly? How did they combine? Could they even be combined? He knew a lot about being a blacksmith. He could make any manner of hand weapon, be it axe, sword, flail, mace or spear tip. He knew how important weight was and heft and thinness of blade. He knew how to judge a metal by its color when heated, to tell when was too cold to beat it and when was too hot to quench. He knew all manner of quenches, which oils to use, which blends, the moment to quench. He knew all about making handles for all kinds of things, again with the width and length so dependent on the man or woman wielding it. But now he was carving runes and making them glow, and he was both proud of the fact that he could do so and terrified of fucking it up by making some mistake that one of the first men runesmiths in the depths of time would never have made even as children. The words had tumbled out of his mouth and he ended up slightly breathless as the bearded old lord of Runestone just sat there and looked at him with those measuring eyes. And after a long moment the lord had just smiled at him and clapped him on the shoulder. By the old gods, you've got a head on those shoulders of yours, Gendry. Good lad. Those are the right things to worry about, the right questions. Lad, you're not alone on this. I've sent ravens to Runestone, the Than are already working on things, and Lord Redfort and I have men here as well. And you? He'd reached out to one side, snagged a book from the table and held it out him. Here you go. It's yours. He'd taken it with a frown. Oh. It was a book about runes. So, this could. That will teach you a lot about runes. It's a copy of an old book from Runestone. Don't lose it, lad, it's valuable. It's mine though. He'd said the words a bit faintly. It's yours. Study hard, lad. There's a lot riding on those runes. He looked down at his hand and the book it held. And then he turned back into the forge, put the book carefully down to one side, shrugged his jerkin off, put a leather apron on, looked at the sheets of bronze to one side and then reached out and opened the book. He had a lot to bloody learn. But learn it he would. And he was Gendry bloody Baratheon, and he'd thump the skull of any snooty twit who said otherwise. Ned. The further south they sailed the warmer he got, and he liked it not. It reminded him too much of Dorne and his search along the border of Dorne and the Stormlands, until he and his companions finally found the so-called Tower of Joy. He knew that he'd have nightmares about that bloody place until his dying day. Friends lost, his sister lost, a burden placed upon him and a sword he had to give back to its rightful owner, and the woman that, in a more sane time, should have been his wife. They'd made good time in their voyage south, but he would still find his fingers drumming on the wood of the railing where he'd stand after his daily walk about the ship whenever they were at sea. He wanted to be there already, he didn't want to spend more time than he had to on this. There was too much to do in the north. They'd docked a few times for supplies, and his brief time at Lannisport had left him with the peculiar feeling that the Lannisters were taking things very seriously indeed, judging by the way that the port was starting to react to the messages from Tywin Lannister in support of the call. Of course there had also been the way that so many of them had reacted to his presence in the Westerlands, staring at him and then muttering about the call and cheering him, and their astonished reaction to Frostfyre, who had taken the opportunity to go hunting along the shore and then vanished for an hour or so in the woods to the west of where they had moored. From the feeling of happy contentment he felt from her direction, as well as the blood around her muzzle when she came back, she had found a good enough meal to take her through her next long nap, almost hibernation, which seemed to be her way of getting through the voyage. After all, a direwolf couldn't exactly squat at the heads on the ship. And the more he thought about the fact that he was feeling what Frostfear felt, the more he wasn't worried. He was coming to terms with it. He was, at some level at least, a warg. Father would have been proud of him, he knew it. Astonished first, but then proud. The winds were kind to the ship, not too strong, not too soft, and as they headed south he ticked the headlands and landmarks off in his mind, as he consulted the maps. He had to admit that the southern lands made him more than a little envious. Green fields, villages all over the place, towns in areas that made best use of the coast or the land. And as they approached the borders of the Reach he became even more envious. Rich lands. Rolling fields of wheat or barley, orchards almost groaning under the weight of their fruit, windmills working industriously away. And then the thought of all of that withering under whatever this mysterious thing was that he'd been called upon to help young Willers Tyrell with made him pause and almost shake his head in horror. The Reach needed his help. This trip was worth it. He had to be here, even though Starks did not prosper south of the Neck. Well, at least he was dealing with Willers Tyrell and not Old Mace. That said, he had long wondered if the man had been a complete fool. The siege of Storm's End had been long and curiously clumsy. Had he done that on purpose, or had he merely been an idiot fixated on something that he lacked the wit to achieve? Would anyone ever know, now that he was dead? It was just to the west of the Shield Islands that the first cry came from the crow's nest that there were ships ahead, coming towards them. Captain Morgan, a blunt man from Torrens Square who knew these waters like the back of his hand, sprinted up the rigging with his Mirish spyglass, took a sighting and then descended via a rope. "A squadron of Reacher ships, Lord Stark," he said, looking puzzled. "And unless I am very much mistaken, one of them is the Arbor Queen." That was a name that made him think back to the Greyjoy Rebellion, and he frowned slightly. "Lord Redwine's flagship." "Aye, my lord. We're almost at the Shield Islands, but not yet near the Arbor, so I'm puzzled." As the ships drew closer, a great flurry of signals burst out from them, which Morgwyn ordered be answered with signals of their own. And then the squadron shook into a clear shape and approached, signaling again. "Lord Stark, Lord Redwine wishes to come aboard at once," Morgwyn said. "Urgent dispatches, they are signaling." Ned nodded, a frisson of dread running through him. "Dispatches? Here?" The squadron of ships came abreast of them and then turned southwards to join them in unison, and Morgwyn muttered that they seemed to be almost decently handled. And then they all collectively slowed as a boat was lowered from the Arbor Queen. Paxter Redwine was a little older and a little balder than Ned remembered him from the Greyjoy Rebellion, but what remaining hair he had was still red, and he still had that look of half amusement and half bellicosity that his sons had obviously inherited. As he hauled his way with practiced ease up the rope ladder that had been let down for him and came level with the deck, he looked about and then saw Ned and nodded firmly. "Lord Redwine," Ned said, bowing to the man as he stood on the deck and took a deep breath. "We meet again. Lord Stark." Paxter Redwine bowed deeply and then looked at him. The call was heard at the Arbor. "House Redwine answers it." He smiled at the man. "And House Stark is grateful for what House Redwine has already done. Your sons were both at the wall and beyond. As they shall tell you." He looked to one side at where a group of other men had gathered and where there were two red-headed young men who looked as if they were barely restraining themselves from dashing over and flinging their arms around their father. "And they have very much to tell you. Horrors and Hobber." Paxter Redwine beamed at his sons but then sobered. "I must greet them in a moment. First, Lord Tyrell sent me to get you to Old Town safely. Ravens came with unsettling news from Winterfell." He looked at the older man's face and ice seemed to run up and down along his back for a heartbeat. "What has happened, Paxter?" "The Lord of the Arbor held out a message. There was an unsuccessful attack against your oldest son, Ned. It's a mad tale, one that made me shake my head, but after getting the earlier letters from my sons about what they saw and witnessed, well, you need to read this." He read it and found his forehead creasing from shock and bafflement. The Mountain had killed 2 men, almost assaulted Val, and then had come within a hair's breadth of killing Robb, before he and Sandor Clegane had killed him. And what was this about Black Eyes, in the most literal sense, and the words about Robb being the wrong Stark? "This is madness," he breathed as he absorbed the implications. "Sorcery. And Valyrian sorcery at that. Apparently Tyrion Lannister's daggers, being the work of the first men, reacted to the body of the mountain Paxter Redwine pointed out. I heard that you bear the fist of winter. Perhaps that will also warn of Valyrian black magic. A shiver ran up and down his spine. I don't know, Paxter, I don't know. Hopefully it will. I hope it does, Paxter Redwine said seriously. Because if you are the right Stark, that means that you need to be protected and defended. I know what worries Willers Tyrell, and that terrifies me. We need you in Old Town, at the High Tower, and every man under my command knows that. So we'll get you there, Lord Stark. We'll bloody well get you there. And only then did he bow formally and then go over and greet his sons, leaving Ned staring down at the message in his hand. Someone might be trying to kill him. Well now. Let them bloody well try it. Robert. He stood there at the top of the wall and stared north. Bloody hells, it was cold up here, the wind like a knife through you if it blew hard enough from the north, and it could. He couldn't quite imagine what it would be like here in the winter that was to come. Worse, far worse than anything he could imagine. He'd known a winter or two in the Vale, when the Eyrie was too cold to be lived in and everyone descended to warmer quarters. At the time he'd thought that that had been the coldest place ever. Not compared to how this place would get. Well now. Best that he started to get used to the cold at the wall whilst they still had summer to enjoy. At least he could start to plan things out now, and he narrowed his eyes as he looked at the trees that stretched off into the far distance and the snowy hills and mountains that he could just about see beyond that. He disliked that damn forest already. You could hide a damn army in that mass of trees, and for all they knew there already was one there. The last of the wildlings were still trickling in, the rearguard in some cases, composed of men and women who had been fighting the others and their whites for months or years. They were all equipped with spears and arrows tipped with dragon glass these days, but they spoke of the enemy having numbers that could swamp even the best equipped force. Fire was still the best deterrent, something that kept the white-haired fuckers back and destroyed their whites, but even the hottest fire could be snuffed out by snow. He thought back to that dream he'd had in Winterfell and the other that had been hunting Lyanna. It was something that still brought a chill to his spine when he remembered the way that the other had looked at him. He'd fought all manner of men before, Dornish, rebel Stormlanders, Reachmen, Crownlanders, Rivermen and Ironborn, but they'd all been men with the faces and expressions of men. That other had been, well, wrong. Alien was the word that he'd heard Maester Aemon use. Yes, that was the word. The right word too. It had looked at him with a look of such indifference, as if he was a beetle beneath its boot. Insignificant. He wasn't used to that. He huffed a little and looked at the forest again. He needed to memorize the view from here and from the night fort and all the bloody castles. They all had people in them again now, even if some of them were little more than ruins that were being rebuilt. Time was their enemy as well now. They needed to rebuild much after centuries of neglect. There were times when he wanted to curse his bloody ancestors, the Valyrian ones at least. The Baratheons and the Targaryens had been too obsessed with cementing their control over the Seven Kingdoms whilst neglecting the needs of the North. The Night's Watch had been protecting all of them, but they hadn't realized that. They'd seen it as this odd northern tradition, or the Stark's private army, or some such rot. The castles should never have been allowed to fall into disrepair. They would take time to repair, rebuild, reman. Gods, he wished that Ned was here with him now. They needed to plan so much. Boots sounded to one side and he looked over to see Tarly approaching and then bowing. Your Grace. Tarly. Up to see the potential field of battle. The bald man quirked a smile at him for a moment before nodding at the silent spectre that was Sir Barristan Selmy to one side. Aye, Your Grace. I do hear tell that you are not fond of a siege. That brought him a tight grin. Stony September. That was a nasty little corner. Pike was better. Better to be the besieger than the besieged. He felt his eyes tighten as he looked north again. We must hold them here. Best place to fight. Narrowest point to the south is the neck, and I don't like the idea of being up to my neck in foul-smelling mud and marsh, do you? No, Your Grace, said Tarly. The logistics will be nasty once winter comes. Aye, and we can't gamble too much with the men. He sighed. Every man and women, I've seen them down there that dies might add to the enemy's number. We have to take that into account. Whites. Bloody magic. Pain in the ass, but we can't ignore that. And this place, he gestured at the wall. When winter comes we'll need protection up here for the men from the wind. If they are freezing to death from the wind as they keep watch, the enemy's winning already. And what if they attack in a blizzard? Can you imagine it? Tali shivered a bit as he looked north as well. You have the right of it, Your Grace, he said eventually. Covered wooden walkways perhaps, with wool between planks. Duckboards to tread on and braziers suspended from the ceilings. It will be expensive, but glass windows here and there. Enough to keep the men alive up here, whilst watching and waiting, he agreed. And then we need to have the ground in front of the wall surveyed. Where is it higher than the land around and where lower? Tali eyed him with a frown and then comprehension dawned. The wildfire. Not much point using it on the buggers if it flows downhill and against the bloody wall. We need maps, Tali. The Lord of Hornhill nodded. I shall talk to the Lord Commander and get on to it once, Your Grace. And then he was gone, walking briskly away. Well now. Tali was a man like him. Born for war. He thought about the sad shadow of a man he had been that Robb Stark had seen in the future that was now gone from them and sighed for a moment. Gods, how had he let himself go so badly? But then that was gone. He was here, now, at this time. And he was fucked if he'd fail in this. He'd not lose this bloody war, there was too much at stake. More boots to one side and he looked over to see the green man approach him. Do you know that I still have no idea how to address you? Sir Duncan. The green man. What should it be? The children of the forest have a title for me, but I fear that neither of us can pronounce it. He chuckled at that, before sobering. What's amiss? I will be heading north into the haunted forest in a day or so with young Jaime Lannister, I need to meet an old acquaintance there. The old man smiled slightly. But before that I need to talk to you about something else. You have come far in this past year, but you need to go further. You must put aside your hatred for Rhaegar Targaryen. It is holding you back, just as your grief for Lyanna Stark did. If you are to become the Storm King that we need you to be, you must move on. He clenched his fists for a long moment as he felt his nostrils flare. You ask much. There are things that you need to understand. This is important, Your Grace. He closed his eyes for a long moment and then nodded choppily. And how can I? What would you suggest? Come with me. You and Barristan. I can show you both what is needed. They followed the green man down to the bottom of the wall and then they mounted the horses that he had ordered saddled. He frowned and then looked at the green man. Where are we going to? North of the wall. We need a heart tree for this. Sir Barristan looked up at this. North of the wall. Is it safe? Should there not be more of us? It is safe, the green man nodded. We have time. The others are moving, I sense, but they are still well north of us. They had to ride half a league to a grove of weirwood trees and he stared at them as they dismounted. 9 of the trees had faces carved into them, faces that seemed to peer at him as if the trees themselves were wondering what and who they all were. He shivered slightly, more in unsettlement than anything else. What should we do? He asked in a careful voice. The green man walked to the middle tree and placed a hand on it, before extending his other arm off to one side, the sleeve rolled up despite the cold. Barristan has done this before, Your Grace. Take your gloves off and hold my bare arm. Frowning a little he pulled off the leather glove on his right hand and then he and Sir Barristan did as the green man had asked. What en? Darkness fell and he had the unsettling feeling of falling straight down, everything too sudden to utter a word. And then, suddenly, he was on the ground, looking around wildly. It was dark, it was warmer, there were men singing off to one side and he could smell wood smoke and food cooking and horse dung. It was a camp. The camp of an army. Someone somewhere was using a whetstone to sharpen a blade and he could smell latrines somewhere. The trident. The words were spoken by Sir Barristan Selmy, in tones of shock. This is the trident. Before the battle at what became known as the Ruby Ford. This was our camp. The camp of Rhaegar Targaryen, the green man rumbled. Who had been at the Isle of Faces not too long before. He was about to mutter something about where that Horson was, when suddenly he saw movement to one side and then a white-cloaked figure strode straight through Selmy's body, passing through it as if it did not exist before coming to a sudden halt and looking around almost wildly. He blinked. It was Selmy himself, or rather a younger version of him, more color in his hair and fewer lines on his face. "I remember this moment," the older Sir Barristan said in a stunned voice. "The night before the battle I had the oddest feeling, as if someone had walked over my grave. I was sensing, myself." "Some circles take time to close," the Green Man said gravely. "But, yes, you were." The Selmy from the past looked about again, before shaking his head and striding off towards a large tent which was surrounded by guards, and then flaming torches and then banners. And the largest of the banners was one that he had not seen for some time. That bloody red many-headed dragon on black. The Targaryen banner. The trio followed him, before slowing slightly as two more white-cloaked figures approached. Sir Barristan. Bloody hells. It was Prince Lewin Martell, along with that earnest bugger Jonnet Hordari. "What news?" "Little and none of it," good the younger Selmy said gruffly. "We know who faces us now and in what numbers. No reinforcements will reach us in time for tomorrow. And Lord Tyrell continues to besiege Storm's End with his full army." Martell and Dari both pulled faces. "Still." Dari barked. "He could invest it with a tenth of the man he has and march north to meet us." "He could, but he has not," the Selmy from the past said. "He is either a fool committed to this siege or he is betraying us." The two Kingsguard traded looks. "I always thought Mace Tyrell to be a damn fool," Martell muttered. "Perhaps I was wrong." "And what of Lord Lannister?" "Nothing. Ravens are sent but return with nothing but empty words, if that. The lion has retracted his claws. Then we must do what we can with what we have." Even then, Dari looked about and then beckoned the other two Kingsguard closer, making Robert also approach. To one side Sir Barristan had his eyes closed as if in pain, whilst the Green Man was staring at the large tent. "Morale is not good. Connington's men are dispirited by their defeat at the Stony September and the Riverlanders are all asunder. The rebels are in full accord however and they are flush with victory and match our numbers." Dari shook his head. "We need more time and more men. Barristan, you must speak with the prince. Persuade him from this course of action. His plan is, well, I think it unwise." "How is his mood?" Dari and Martell exchanged glances, before the Dornishman answered, "Also not good. He sleeps badly, he looks tired all the time now and he seems dispirited. Although he received a letter from King's Landing early today, written by little Rhaenys, which has lifted his spirits a little." The Selmy from the past gods this was strange. Frowned a little. "I wish I knew what happened at the Isle of Faces. He was downcast before and then truly depressed after that." Martell glared at Dari. "If you had bloody well done your duty and stayed with him on that bloody island then." "I could not." Dari glared back, before an unsettled expression crossed his face. "Prince Rhaegar instructed me not to follow him, that I could not come with him, that I had to wait at that jetty. But I tried to. He walked down that path between those white bloody trees and I waited a moment and then tried to follow him by walking through the trees. But after a few minutes I lost sight of him and then somehow the path was gone. I swear it, my brothers. I wandered and I ran and I looked and then I was back at the shore. I ran again, back to the jetty and the path was gone. I know this seems like madness, but, well, it was gone. I walked, I looked, I went back into the trees, but there was no path. Every time I ended up back on the shore, heading back to the jetty. I swear it. Something kept me from the prince. And then, after a while, I looked up and there he was, walking back on the path. Looking like he does now." The Green Man chuckled slightly to one side. "The Isle of Faces keeps its secrets well." Martell was looking at Dari in bafflement, before looking back at Selmy. "Barristan, you must persuade the prince to change his mind. If we must fight the rebels tomorrow then we must be at his side. The plan of his to scatter us across the battlefield, it goes against every one of my instincts. We must be there at his side. If we can press hard and kill one of the main traitor lords then we can prevail against them. Should Stark, or are in, or especially Baratheon falls, then their ranks will waver and split. The younger Selmy looked uncertain but then nodded. I will try. I cannot promise anything, but I will try. And so they followed him as he walked to the large tent with the Targaryen banner. Robert swallowed back his bile as they approached it and forced himself to be calmer than he felt. Gods! He couldn't believe that he was here, seeing this. The Selmy from the past talked to the guards by the entrance to the tent and then entered it and they followed him in. Sir Barristan had an odd expression on his face as he walked by Robert's side and the Green Man had a look of faint distaste. He saw his cousin at once as he entered the tent and could not help the growl of hate that emerged from his throat. And then he blinked as Rhaegar Targaryen looked up from the papers on the table in front of him and for a moment seemed to look straight at Robert, his eyes widening for a moment before he saw the other Selmy. And by all the gods he could see that Rhaegar looked terrible. He was pale, he looked as if he had not slept properly for a week at least, or a month, such were the black lines under his eyes and his hands shook slightly. Barristan. The Barristan from the past bowed. My prince. What news? The scouts have confirmed that we face the full force of the rebels, my prince. They match our numbers. Baratheon is here, along with Stark, Tully and Arryn. The morale of our men is not good and the Tyrells and Lannisters are not here. My prince, surely we should wait or retreat to gain the advantage of numbers and better ground. Rhaegar looked at him and then around the tent, before sitting again at the table and passing a trembling hand over his eyes. If morale is not good, then how many would desert if we retreated? Some cravens would flee, I will not deny it. But if we sent messages to Lord Tyrell, ordering him, in the name of the king, to send us just a third of his host, then we can prevail. The man that he hated so much bit his lip for a moment. He seemed genuinely torn. What was so clear a week ago is not anymore, he muttered. And what was clear this morning is also not clear. He closed his eyes for a long moment. I must think on this, Barristan. Rhaenys wrote me a letter. The past Selmy looked confused for a long moment at this change of topic. A letter, my prince. She is so young and yet so talented already. A letter to her daddy, telling me about her cat, Balerion. And telling me to beat the bad men and come home so that she can kiss me on both cheeks and show me her cat. The Selmy from the present closed his eyes in anguish and Robert felt himself swallow. Oh! That poor child. The Selmy from the past nodded. Your daughter is much loved. She is. Rhaegar looked about the tent again. Barristan, I need to think and also to pray. I will call you once I have made a decision. And please move the guards a little away from the tent, I must not be overheard. My prince. Barristan. Double the guards if need be, but move them and yourself away from the tent. I must not be overheard. The Selmy from the past looked confused but then nodded and strode out of the tent, calling out to the captains of the guard. As he did so, the Selmy from the present looked at Robert. I remember this. We could hear him talking at one point, but no one knew what he was saying. We will know now, the Green Man said grimly. He doubted the path I told him to take. It was hard for him not to after his child wrote to him. There was a long moment of silence in the tent as Rhaegar looked at the letter in front of him, but then as the sound of men marching away from the tent diminished, he looked up again. You're here again, aren't you? The presence I felt in the hall of the Green Man at the Isle of Faces. I heard something, sensed something. What are you? Who are you? The old gods. My ancestors. The silver-haired young man walked about the tent slowly. I know what must be done tomorrow, I know, but how many must die before my own sacrifice is enough? I know that I must die, but I want to live. I want to see my daughter again and hear the tales of her cat. I want to see my son again, and the daughter that Lyanna will bear me. I have a wife that I still love, a mother that I must protect and father whose crimes I must make right. But how can I if I must die? His face crumpled for a long moment and he sank back into his chair again. I am not afraid to die. But I also want to live. So, tell me. What must I do? There was a horrible strained silence in the tent. Robert looked at the man, an unexpected sympathy welling up for him, matching the hatred. Gods! He looked over at the green man. And yet he will still fight in the morning. What are we here to do? Draw Stormbreaker, place the tip of the sword on the ground in front of you, hold the hilt with both hands and trust me, your grace. The green man closed his eyes for a long moment, and then when he opened them again there was a red fire burning in them. He will see you. And you will know when and what to speak. He did what the green man had said, drawing Storm